In 1872, beneath the brutal sun of northern Mesopotamia, the clay tablet was unearthed from the ruins of Nineveh, a dead imperial throat choked with sand, broken brick, and buried breath. The excavation site lies near what is now called Mosul, Iraq, where the earth still coughs up fragments of forgotten empires. The archaeologist's hands were dust-caked and shaking when he first felt the hardened clay, as if the ground resisted surrendering it. They lifted the tablet carefully, like removing a bone from a sacred grave. Its edges were cracked but stubbornly intact, and its face was crowded with cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks cut into clay, like wounds that never healed. Around it lay shattered fragments of other tablets, teeth of a broken archive, and blackened debris from fires long extinct. Even the air in the ruin felt heavy, as if the chamber remembered what it had been forced to contain. That night, beneath a canvas tent trembling in the desert wind, the archaeologist held the tablet close to lamplight. The carved signs caught shadow in their grooves, and the shadows seemed to move, shifting like something alive under the surface. Outside, men laughed and drank, celebrating discovery. But inside the lamplight's thin circle, the archaeologist did not smile. He stared at the ancient words until dawn, sensing this was not history. It was a door. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Stone walls rose where the horizon should have been, long and brutal, as if the earth had grown teeth in self-defense. Behind them stood Uruk, a mighty walled city of fired brick and carved stone. Civilization hardened into architecture. Towers sharpened the skyline. Gates swallowed caravans whole. From far away, it looked like triumph made permanent, as though mankind had dared the world to erase it. Inside, life moved with practiced discipline. Canals carried water through streets like veins trained to obey. Markets opened like mouths hungry for silver and grain. Smoke climbed from ovens and offerings alike, blending bread with prayer. Workers laid brick upon brick as if piling weight onto the earth could stop it from shifting. Civilization called this order. The body called it survival. But safety did not live here. Prosperity clung to Uruk like perfume over sweat, sweet until you stood too close. Conversations ended early when heavy footsteps approached. Faces softened only in private corners, then hardened again under daylight. Fear was not dramatic. It was constant, thin as dust, settling into door frames and throats, making every breath feel borrowed, making every joy feel like theft. At the city's center, a palace squatted like a mountain of shadow, swallowing sunlight and returning only silence. It was not merely a home for power. It was a mouth, feeding on labor, fear, and the soft parts of human life. Men entered its gates with straight backs and came out bent. Mothers passed nearby like they were walking beside a grave that watched. And from that palace came Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, born of mixed blood. 2/3 god and 1/3 man, divine force sealed inside mortal skin. He was built like a war statue, come alive, tall, broad-shouldered, chest plated in muscle like natural armor. His hair fell thick and black, heavy as storm clouds, and his eyes burned too bright and steady, as if skyfire lived behind them. He did not rule like a man, he ruled like pressure. His rule did not feel like governance. It felt like weather. When he moved through streets, the city tightened around him, bracing like a body anticipating pain. Guards stepped quickly, not to protect him, but to shield others from his attention. Men lowered their eyes. Women pulled children away. No one needed to be struck daily. His presence carried enough threat to do the work. The cruelty was not random, and that was the deeper terror. Random cruelty is chaos you can pray will pass. This cruelty had rhythm, structure, intention. He took what pleased him, because power overflowed inside him like floodwater. It spilled into Uruk and drowned quiet lives. He did not steal from need. He stole from excess, as if the world existed to prove him real. No one spoke against him in daylight. Words were too fragile to survive that gaze. Instead, the people learned endurance, smiles that meant nothing, praise that tasted like ash, silence shaped into obedience. At night, prayer became whisper and trembling hands. They begged for small mercies, sons to remain unnoticed, daughters to remain unchosen, homes to escape royal hunger one more day. The priests offered explanations like bandages that could not stop bleeding. They spoke of divine testing, of strength forged through hardship, of kings as burdens bestowed by heaven. The people nodded because agreement kept them alive. Yet in private, bitterness grew. Strength without restraint is not protection. It is a threat wearing a familiar face, forcing everyone to call fear loyalty. Above it all, the gods remained silent. But silence from gods does not mean absence. It means watching. It means weighing. The city's suffering rose like heat from stone, invisible yet persistent. Slowly, like pressure building behind a dam, Uruk's endurance became more than endurance. It became imbalance, and imbalance is something the universe eventually corrects. In the unseen places where divinity gathers, judgment is not spoken the way humans speak it. There are no councils with shouting voices, no mercy negotiated into policy. A divine decision is felt as reality shifting. Rivers lean into new paths. Dreams sharpen into warnings. Animals grow restless without knowing why. When Uruk began to rot with fear, the gods noticed like a body noticing infection. They did not call the king wicked. Wickedness is a human word meant to make pain feel meaningful. The gods saw something colder, excess, a fire too large for its hearth, a crown pulling too much destiny into one skull. Gilgamesh was divine pressure trapped in mortal flesh, and Uruk had become the bruise left behind. Correction was necessary, not from hatred, but from law. The first omen arrived wearing the face of panic. A hunter stumbled into the city with dirt on his lips and terror in his eyes, as if the wilderness had rearranged his bones. His traps had been crushed, his nets torn apart like spider webs. The animals he meant to harvest had fled untouched, leaving behind only silence and ruined work. He spoke of a man-shaped figure moving between trees, wild-haired like a beast's mane, body streaked with clay and animal musk, shoulders built for violence, eyes empty of negotiation. The city listened the way a wounded animal listens for the predator's return. Wolves could be hunted, bandits bribed. But this felt older, the wilderness refusing its leash, wearing flesh like armor. Word climbed toward the palace, and the king's attention turned like a blade catching light. Here was something untrained by fear, untouched by law, something that might stand without bowing, not from bravery, but from innocence. Gilgamesh's mouth curved into hunger. Outside the gates, the wilderness breathed, and somewhere in tall grass, the god's correction began walking toward Uruk, without knowing the name of what he was meant to break. In the unseen places where gods weigh the world, decisions are not spoken, they are felt. The sky grows heavier. Rivers lean into new paths. Dreams sharpen like blades without hands. The divine do not gather around tables or thrones. They gather as pressure, as inevitability, as the slow turning of the story's spine. When Uruk began to rot with fear, the gods noticed like a body noticing infection. They did not pity the city. Pity is human, and humans pity because they cannot change what hurts. The gods diagnose. They measure imbalance the way stonecutters measure cracks, calmly and without comfort. Uruk's wealth glittered outward, but its spirit bent inward, trembling under its king's weight. A city built to defy the horizon had begun to kneel beneath its own greatness, and kneeling breeds sickness. The king was not labeled evil, because gods do not waste judgment on morality. They saw excess. Gilgamesh was too much, too strong, too hungry, too loud in the world's design. Divine blood burned in him like a furnace without a vent. The pressure spilled into Uruk's streets, into ordinary lives, into fear. The city had become the vessel catching his overflow, bruised by the shape of his greatness. For a time, the gods tolerated it. Cities rise and fall, and immortals watch them crack like clay jars dropped from careless hands. But fear curdles worship. Fear turns offerings bitter. A city that kneels only to survive stops believing. The gods prefer belief, because belief is devotion freely given, not obedience forced by terror. Uruk's prayers had begun to sound like begging, and begging is not reverence. So divine attention narrowed, precise as a blade finding its target. Balance had been disturbed, and balance cannot remain disturbed forever. Excess invites correction, the way height invites lightning. The gods did not seek revenge. They sought restoration, because restoration is law, and law does not feel mercy. It simply turns the world back toward equilibrium, no matter what bones crack in the process. Punishment would have been easy. A plague through the streets, a famine in the markets, a blade in the king's ribs while he slept. But punishment only teaches fear, and Uruk already drowned in fear. Fear would not heal the imbalance, it would deepen it. The gods did not want Gilgamesh terrified. Terror makes monsters sharper. They wanted him checked, pressed against something strong enough to resist him. Opposition was cleaner. A heavy scale is corrected by another weight, not by shattering the scale itself. The gods decided a counterforce must be made, not found. Something designed with purpose, shaped as an answer rather than raised as a child. No human army could accomplish this. Soldiers tire. Priests bargain. Even heroes fear consequence. The king feared nothing because he believed he authored consequence. So the gods reached for the oldest material in existence, raw earth. Not palace soil ground flat by sandals and blood, not temple dirt sweetened with incense. Wilderness soil, untouched by law, thick with roots and bones and old silence. In the wild, hunger is honest and survival is sacred. A creature formed there does not kneel to crowns. It kneels only to necessity. And necessity does not negotiate. The shaping was not gentle. Intention was pressed into clay until clay became muscle. Breath was poured into lungs until lungs demanded air. Bone formed hard beneath skin, like law made physical. A body rose, broad and heavy with strength, hair thick and wild like an untamed mane, skin still clinging to mud as if the earth refused to release its weapon. It was not born into the world. It was released. This being was called Enkidu, though names mean nothing until someone speaks them with purpose. In those first moments, he did not understand language, only sensation. Cold air stinging his lungs, hunger gnawing, wind scraping skin like claws. He stood in the wilderness as a thing made for balance, violence wrapped in innocence. The gods had crafted correction, and correction had begun to breathe. The wilderness received him the way storms receive rain, without celebration, without rejection, simply as something that belongs. Animals did not flee. Antelope watched, then returned to grazing. Wolves circled at distance without challenge. Enkidu moved among them like a strange sibling, not predator and not prey, guided by instinct instead of thought. He drank from rivers without fear. He slept under open sky without fear. Fear requires lessons. He had none. He learned quickly through pain and motion. Hunger carved him into strength. Cold nights hardened his bones. His muscles grew dense, built for impact rather than beauty. The wild taught him with cruelty that did not pretend to be kind. He absorbed its rules completely. What threatens balance must be broken. When he found hunter traps, he tore them apart. When nets tightened around animals, he shredded them like dead grass. Hunters began to speak of him like a curse. They returned to ruined snares and empty pits, whispering of a man-beast walking among herds, wild-haired and mud-streaked, shoulders like stone, eyes empty of bargain. They feared him because he could not be bribed, could not be shamed, could not be reasoned with. Civilization survives by teaching hesitation. Enkidu had no hesitation. He was action given legs. The fear traveled back toward Uruk like a look on bitter wind. Men entered the city with trembling voices, carrying humiliation and dread into marketplaces and temples. Guards stiffened. Mothers pulled children close. Elders listened with narrowed eyes. A beast could be hunted, but a human-shaped force rising from the wilderness felt like omen. The city did not understand the gods' design, but it could taste destiny shifting in the air. And in the palace, Gilgamesh heard the report and smiled. His eyes brightened with hunger, not concern. Here was something outside his reach, something untrained by law, something that might resist him without even meaning to. He did not suspect divine correction. He only sensed a challenge worth crushing. Beyond the walls, Enkidu moved through tall grass, pulled toward the city by fate's gravity, and balance began walking toward collision. Beyond Uruk's walls, where farmland surrendered to thorn and tall grass, the wilderness stretched like an unblinking eye. There were no roads, only animal trails and broken branches, only wind moving through reeds like whispered warning. The land felt older there, less forgiving, a place where survival was the only law that mattered. Civilization did not soften it. Prayer did not tame it. Hunger ruled cleanly. Enkidu moved through that raw world as if it had made him from its own breath. His body was broad and heavy with muscle, built for impact rather than beauty, and his hair hung thick and wild like a beast's mane. Mud clung to his skin as if the earth refused to let him go. His eyes carried no city thought, only alertness sharpened by instinct. He belonged to the wild the way storms belong. The animals did not fear him. Antelope watched him and returned to grazing. Wolves circled without challenge. Birds did not scatter. He ran when herds ran, stopped when they stopped, drank when they drank. The wilderness accepted him as kin because he moved by the same laws it obeyed. Hunger, survival, reaction. In that belonging, he was innocent, not gentle, but unashamed. Shame is a human chain. He had none. When cold came, he endured it. When hunger came, he hunted. His hands were weapons, his shoulders shields, his teeth bared when needed. Pain did not frighten him. Pain was information. He learned what cut and what crushed. He did not imagine tomorrow, did not fear endings, lived only inside the present moment, sharp, total, unquestioning. Civilization survives by teaching hesitation. Enkidu was pure motion without pause. In that purity lived danger. A being without shame cannot be controlled. He did not know mercy as virtue, only balance as necessity. If something harmed the wild, it offended him like a wound in his own ribs. The gods had shaped him as correction, a counterweight meant to meet a king too heavy with divinity. Enkidu did not know Uruk existed, but his existence already bent the story toward it. The first trap he found was hidden beneath leaves, waiting with quiet cruelty. A pit meant to break legs, a snare meant to tighten like a noose. Enkidu did not understand it as craft. He understood it as harm disguised as absence, violence pretending to be nothing until it became everything. Predators kill openly, storms destroy openly. But this was dishonest death, and dishonesty offended him more than blood. He tore the trap apart with hands that did not hesitate. Wood snapped, stakes bent, rope shredded like dry grass between his fingers. He did not free the animals because he loved them in a human way. He freed them because their suffering felt like insult. The wilderness had rules, brutal but honest. These traps broke them. He ruined snares the way fire ruins paper, quickly and without remorse. Hunters returned to find their work destroyed. Nets ripped, pits filled, snares twisted into useless knots. Profit vanished. Food vanished. Control vanished. They began whispering of a man-beast haunting the grasslands, wild-haired and clay-streaked, moving like storm in human shape. Men fear monsters less than they fear meaning. This felt like meaning, nature speaking back, refusing to be owned. Some hunters tried to confront him. Their spears and nets looked childish against a creature that did not fear injury. Enkidu struck fast, heavy, direct. He did not threaten or bargain. He acted like lightning acts, without hatred, without apology. Men fled, and fleeing became their only wisdom. The wilderness had become dangerous again, not because it grew new teeth, but because it grew a protector. Fear traveled toward Uruk like woke on bitter wind. Hunters entered the city with trembling voices, spreading panic through markets and temples. Guards stiffened. Mothers pulled children close. Elders listened with narrowed eyes. A beast could be hunted, but a human-shaped force rising from the wilderness felt like omen. Without knowing it, the hunters began dragging divine correction toward civilization, step by unavoidable step. The city received the story the way a wounded body receives infection, with immediate tightening, with instinctive dread. Uruk was already sick with fear beneath its king. Now another fear arrived from outside its walls, older and less negotiable. People whispered of deep footprints, of shattered traps, of animals freed as if judged. They did not understand the god's design, but they understood the feeling, the world tilting toward collision. The elders carried the report upward, because all fear eventually climbs toward power. The palace hall swallowed the hunters' voices, making terror sound smaller than it was. At the far end sat Gilgamesh, tall and broad-shouldered, his chest plated in muscle like natural armor, his dark hair heavy, his gaze too bright and steady to meet without flinching. He listened with the stillness of a predator smelling prey. The report landed like meat thrown before a starving mouth. Gilgamesh did not hear warning. He heard challenge. Something outside his rule refused capture, refused law, refused fear. That refusal pleased him. Kings crave conquest the way lungs crave air. The idea of a rival untrained by civilization excited him in a way obedience never could. His smile sharpened into hunger, and hunger became intent. Outside the palace, Uruk kept living because ordinary life refuses to stop for prophecy. Bread baked, water ran, brickmakers worked with dust on their arms. Yet tension tightened beneath every motion, invisible but constant. People feared the wild man, but they feared more what the king would do in answer. One storm is dangerous. Two storms meeting is ruin. Beyond the gates, Enkidu lifted his head as smoke reached him on the wind, human smoke, thick with cooked grain and crowded breath. The scent carried stone and captivity. He did not understand it, but his body answered. Instinct pulled him forward like a hook in the ribs. He began walking toward Uruk without knowing its name, because fate does not require knowledge. It only requires movement, and balance was on the move. Steel could not threaten what did not fear death, so Uruk chose a softer weapon. Civilization's sharpest blade is not a spear. It is invitation. It is the slow art of changing what a creature believes it is. The elders sought Shamhat, a sacred courtesan trained as ritual doorway, someone whose intimacy was treated as temple work. They did not send her to seduce a man. They sent her to civilize a storm. Shamhat moved with deliberate calm, her body carrying incense and wine like a second skin. Her hair fell in dark waves down her back, and her eyes held a steady authority that did not ask permission to be obeyed. Jewelry glinted at her throat and wrists like captured starlight. She did not look fragile. She looked controlled, crafted, a human offering shaped to bend wildness into obedience. Her softness was not weakness. It was tool. When she reached the wilderness, the land greeted her with a silence that felt intelligent. Grass brushed her ankles, like cautious fingers. The air smelled of animal musk and cold water. She followed the hunter's path until the earth felt less touched, less human, more ancient and unforgiving. The farther she walked, the more the world seemed to watch her intrusion, as if even wind hesitated around her footsteps. Enkidu appeared between tall grass like a myth rising from mud. He was broad-shouldered and clay-streaked, hair thick and wild like a beast's mane, chest rising with a steady animal rhythm. His eyes were bright and wary, untrained by human meaning. He watched her as a wolf watches fire, uncertain, alert, drawn. Shamhat did not speak at first. Words would have been noise. Presence was her language. She stepped closer and let civilization announce itself through comfort, perfume, warmth, softness. Enkidu approached cautiously, pulled by instincts he did not understand. Hunger shifted shape inside him, becoming something new and sharp. When he touched her, it was not tenderness. It was discovery, Storm learning it could become lightning. Shamhat accepted him without flinching, guiding him gently but firmly, and the first wound opened. The intimacy lasted long enough to feel like time breaking open. When it ended, Enkidu sat with new awareness burning under his skin like fever. His breathing sounded different, heavier, as if air itself had changed. Shamhat watched quietly, knowing transformation is never complete until it costs something. Civilization does not enter gently. It enters like a blade that leaves knowledge behind. Enkidu had been awakened into a new kind of hunger. He rose and moved toward the animals as he always had, expecting the wild to welcome him back. Instead, the herds shifted away. Antelope fled. Birds lifted suddenly. Wolves watched from distance with narrowed eyes, uncertain and tense. The wilderness recognized change the way fire recognizes oil. Something in Enkidu's scent had altered, and the wild rejected him without cruelty, without explanation. He had become strange, and strange is dangerous. This was the first true tragedy. He lost Eden without knowing Eden existed. Eden was wordless belonging, the kinship of beasts, the ease of living without self-awareness. Now he was aware. He felt separation like a blade between ribs. He returned to Shamhat with confusion and anger rising hot in his throat. His hands flexed as if they could tear meaning apart. But you cannot strike exile until it bleeds. Exile simply remains. Shamhat did not apologize. She did not soothe him with forced comfort. She told him the truth in calm, steady words. He was changed now. He was human now. And to become human is to be separated forever, from pure instinct, from animal belonging, from the innocence of not knowing you are alone. Enkidu trembled, because trembling was new. Grief entered him for the first time, and grief is the beginning of a soul. She fed him bread, warm and soft, and the taste startled him like miracle. She offered beer, bitter and foaming, and he coughed before swallowing. She cleaned mud from his skin and combed his tangled hair, teaching him that humans alter themselves to be accepted. Then she clothed him, fabric wrapping him like a second prison. The weight of clothing felt like belonging purchased with surrender. Enkidu endured it because he had nowhere else to return. As they traveled toward Uruk, Shamhat spoke of walls and temples, markets rich with grain, laws strong enough to hold chaos at bay. Enkidu listened with growing unease. The city she described sounded like a beast made of stone and noise, hungry in ways the wilderness never was. Yet something in him leaned towards it anyway. Pride pulled him forward. Curiosity pulled him forward. Exile itself pulled him forward, because there was no other direction left. When Uruk's walls rose in the distance, Enkidu felt the air change before he reached them. Smoke thickened on the wind, carrying cooked grain and crowded breath. The city smelled trapped, dense with human life pressed into stone. Shamhat stepped beside him without hesitation, because she belonged there. Enkidu stood tense, broad and heavy, his wild strength barely contained by clothes that still felt wrong on his skin. Inside the gates, people stared like prey sensing a predator's outline. Children were pulled behind skirts. Men shifted away. Enkidu's eyes were too direct, his posture too ready, his body too honest in its violence. He looked like wilderness walking through civilization's ribs. Shamhat guided him through markets and temples, past incense and prayer, toward the palace shadow that lay over the city like a curse. Enkidu felt something tighten at the sight. Word spread fast. A wild man had entered Uruk. Some whispered he would challenge the king. Some whispered he would bring disaster. The elders watched carefully, sensing fate turning. Enkidu walked forward with the wild still coiled inside him, but now he carried something else too. Self-awareness, grief, hunger for meaning. Those things made him more dangerous than strength ever could. A beast can be killed. A man with purpose becomes story. That night, Enkidu lay restless beneath a roof, hearing city noise press in around him. Voices, footsteps, distant cries. He stared into darkness and understood the wilderness. Silence was gone. Forever. He could not return to the herds. He could not undo what he had learned. He was exiled into humanity, carrying loss like a new organ inside his chest. Somewhere in the palace, the king slept, unaware balance had arrived at his door. Fear tightened around Uruk as Enkidu moved through its streets, not because stone changed, but because people did. His heavy footsteps struck the ground like dull drums. Faces vanished into doorways. Conversations died mid-sentence. He looked wrong among brick and order, broad-shouldered, wild-haired, eyes too direct, like an animal forced into a shrine. The city had been terrorized by a king, and now another kind of terror walked in. Shamhat guided him toward the palace with calm precision, her posture steady, her expression controlled like ritual. She had brought a wild force into civilization's hands, but she had not tamed him. Enkidu's strength remained coiled and ready beneath his borrowed clothes. He did not understand law, only dominance. And the palace radiated dominance like heat. Even before he reached it, his muscles tightened, sensing a threat larger than hunters. At the palace gates, guards lifted spears and voices, pretending authority could shape him. Enkidu did not understand their words, only the meaning behind them. Stop, submit, obey. His lips curled, his hands flexed. He shoved through them, and men stumbled like reeds struck by wind. Steel scraped uselessly against his shoulders. Blood appeared and meant nothing. The city's order cracked with one motion, and alarm spread fast. Shouts rose. More guards rushed. Nets flew and fell useless. Enkidu struck like a beast cornered, fast and heavy, fists landing with the wilderness's indifference. A man hit stone hard enough to gasp. Another fell and did not rise quickly. The crowd fled from the violence, yet could not stop watching. Kings do not bleed in public. Guards do not fail in public. Uruk trembled because something impossible was happening. The noise reached the palace like smoke. Inside, Gilgamesh rose as if waking had been waiting for this moment. His body, tall, broad-shouldered, chest plated in muscle like natural armor, moved with effortless confidence. His dark hair fell heavy, and his eyes burned bright and steady, the kind of gaze that makes men bow without being told. He stepped into the street, and the air tightened around him like a fist. The clash began without announcement. Gilgamesh looked at Enkidu and felt not fear, but insult, something outside his rule refusing to kneel. Enkidu looked at Gilgamesh and felt instinctive opposition, as if the palace itself had grown teeth and taken human shape. The crowd fell silent, sensing something larger than fight. Two forces built too large for the world's comfort had finally met, and Uruk became their arena. They struck like weather colliding. Gilgamesh moved first, not desperate, but certain, hands skilled in dominance. Enkidu met him like a wall meets a battering ram, bodies slamming with a sound that made people flinch. Stone dust rose beneath their feet. Gilgamesh's strength was refined by arrogance and training. Enkidu's strength was raw, carved by hunger and survival. They grappled like beasts, pushing and twisting, tearing breath loose. The crowd watched with open terror. Gilgamesh's lip split, blood bright against his skin. The sight shocked them more than any scream. Kings are not supposed to bleed. Enkidu's shoulder bruised dark where a blow landed, yet he did not retreat. They broke brick with their bodies, collided against walls, struggled for leverage like giants, wrestling for the right to exist. Each strike landed heavy enough to shake courage loose from witnesses. For a moment, Gilgamesh tried to pin Enkidu down, pressing him into the earth like civilization forcing wilderness to kneel. Enkidu surged upward, roaring, shaking him off like an animal throwing a rider. The movement did not merely hurt the king. It proved something unthinkable. He could be resisted. That realization cut deeper than any fist. Gilgamesh's eyes sharpened. Enkidu's eyes brightened. The fight became recognition in blood. Then the violence shifted. The air between them changed texture, as if fate clicked into place. They circled, breathing hard, and in the space where hatred should have lived, respect began to form. Dark, reluctant, undeniable. A mirror had arrived that did not bend. A force existed that did not fear him. The world could not hold two storms apart without breaking, so it began to fuse them, whether they wanted it or not. The fight ended not with a killing blow, but with stillness. Gilgamesh lowered his fists slowly, tasting blood like unfamiliar truth. Enkidu stood ready to strike again, chest heaving, but hesitation entered him like a new organ. Hesitation was human. Hesitation was thought. The city watched, stunned, as violence paused without finishing. In that pause, fate rewrote itself. Two enemies stood balanced, and balance demanded something different than slaughter. Gilgamesh laughed, low and sharp, not mocking but astonished. He had crushed countless men and grown haunted doing it. This was different. This was an equal. Enkidu's resistance cracked open, something tyranny had sealed shut, exposing a hunger that was not merely for domination, but for greatness. The king's appetite shifted shape, turning outward like a spear. No longer satisfied with devouring his people, he craved conquest worthy of his strength. For Enkidu, brotherhood was a strange wound. The wilderness had never required companionship, only survival. Now he stood beside a king whose violence matched his own, and something inside him stirred beyond hunger for meat. His instincts reached toward legend. He felt the pull of story, the desire to carve his name into the world before it could forget him. Purpose entered him, sharp and dangerous as a blade. Uruk responded with trembling hope. A king balanced by an equal felt safer than a king unchecked. People dared to imagine fewer stolen nights, fewer crushed lives. Yet hope is reckless. Reckless things invite punishment. The gods do not reward balance with peace. They demand payment for every shift. Two storms fused into one only meant the next strike would be larger, louder, harder for the city to survive. One evening, the brothers stood atop Uruk's walls, staring into the darkening horizon as if it were an open mouth calling them forward. Greatness is a hunger that grows by being fed. Gilgamesh spoke of deeds that would not die. Enkidu listened, eager and newly haunted by meaning. Their eyes turned toward the forbidden, a sacred cedar forest sealed by divine law, waiting like a wound stitched shut, guarded by something monstrous and holy. Morning rose over Uruk with a tension that felt earned. The city had not yet learned how to breathe around two storms walking side by side. People watched from doorways as the king and the wilderness-born man moved through streets together, their shadows long and fused. Some faces held relief, others dread. Balance had arrived, but balance does not always feel like peace. Sometimes it feels like a blade finally set straight. Gilgamesh's presence still bent the air, but it bent differently now. There was less careless appetite in his gaze, less hunger to devour the city for sport. Meeting an equal had cracked something open in him. Tyranny, when unchallenged, becomes habit. Challenged tyranny becomes ambition. He looked outward more often, toward horizons and threats, and the idea of greatness that did not require feeding on his people's fear. Enkidu walked beside him like a living warning. His thick, wild hair still framed his face, and his body remained heavy with wilderness strength, yet his eyes carried new thought. The city's noise did not overwhelm him anymore. It sharpened him. He watched humans bargain, pray, laugh, and lie, learning quickly that civilization hunts in quieter ways than wolves. He did not trust it, but he began to understand it. Uruk felt the shift like weather changing. People whispered more freely in their homes. They looked at the palace with less despair. Two forces had fused, and the city dared to believe the king's hunger might march outward instead of inward. Yet outward hunger brings its own dread. The people knew that great men rarely become gentle. They simply become focused, and focus, sharpened by pride, becomes dangerous in new directions. In temples, priests burned incense heavier than before, trying to guide fate away from Uruk's heart. Smoke rose in thick, trembling spirals. Offerings piled like desperate bribes. But the gods remained silent, and silence is not always permission. Sometimes, silence is a trap waiting for the next step. The brothers did not notice. They only felt the pull of story tightening around them, inviting them toward a conquest big enough to scar time. Restlessness grew in Gilgamesh like thirst. Peace tasted bland to a man bred for conquest, without a monster to crush. His strength threatened to rot back into cruelty. Enkidu's presence kept that rot from blooming, but it also inflamed the king's pride. He had been matched once. Now he wanted the world itself to feel his weight. He wanted a deed so large, even the gods would be forced to remember his name. The elders sensed it and grew uneasy. A king facing outward is better than a king feeding inward. Yet outward hunger still brings disaster home. They had seen how Gilgamesh's appetites worked. If he craved greatness, he would demand a stage large enough for it. Cities are always the first stage kings use. The elders feared Uruk would become collateral in its own legend, bricks and bodies sacrificed for a story written in blood. Enkidu watched the king's eyes lift toward the horizon and recognized the look. In the wilderness, it was the look of a predator choosing prey. He understood momentum more than consequence. A storm that begins moving does not stop because villages beg. It empties itself where it can. Yet Enkidu was not merely following Gilgamesh anymore. Brotherhood had bound him. He wanted purpose. He wanted meaning beyond survival. He wanted legend, too. So they spoke of conquest like hunger, not duty. They spoke of enemies beyond Uruk, lands untouched by their strength, deeds that would carve their names into clay for centuries. Gilgamesh wanted immortality through story. Enkidu wanted identity through action. Together, they formed an appetite large enough to swallow quiet places. Greatness grew between them like a third presence, invisible but heavy, always leaning them forward. The city listened and trembled. Some hoped the king's hunger, leaving Uruk, would bring relief. Others feared the hunger would return worse, swollen by victory. Hope and dread braided together until neither could be separated. Preparation began quietly. Metal sharpened, supplies gathered, prayers whispered. Uruk watched its storms become organized, and that organization felt terrifying. Wild danger is one thing. Purposeful danger becomes fate. Gilgamesh named the target, and the words fell like a stone into still water. The cedar forest, a sacred region sealed by divine law. It was said its trees stood impossibly tall, older than cities, older than certain gods' mercy. It was said the forest was guarded by a power meant to keep mortals out forever. To Gilgamesh, a boundary was an insult. Boundaries exist to be broken. His smile sharpened, as if offered a challenge crafted for him alone. Enkidu's body reacted before his mind did. The wilderness had taught him to respect certain silences, certain places where even predators move carefully. A forest guarded by divine enforcement felt like such a place. Yet his hunger for meaning pushed against that caution. If Gilgamesh sought greatness, Enkidu wanted to stand beside him and prove he belonged in this world of legend. Fear did not stop him. It only made the choice heavier. The elders argued carefully, softly, as if loud disagreement might wake the king's cruelty. They warned that sacred places are sacred because they punish trespass. They reminded him Uruk needed stability, not glory. Gilgamesh heard caution as weakness. Greatness does not ask permission. Greatness takes. He promised them cedar timber for temples, fame for the city, a story so powerful even death would hesitate to erase it. The elders fell silent, because silence kept them alive. The day they left, Uruk's gates opened like a mouth releasing a curse. The brothers walked out together, and their presence seemed to steal weight from the streets behind them. Gilgamesh moved with confident certainty. Enkidu moved with quiet readiness. Their shadows stretched forward, merging on the road like a single dark creature. The city watched them go with the fear of people watching a storm march away, praying it does not return. Beyond the fields, the land slowly grew older. Trees thickened. Birds grew quieter. The air tasted different, heavy with restraint, as if the world ahead did not obey the same rules as the world behind. The brothers felt it too, time stretching strangely, silence sharpening. Yet they kept walking, because pride refuses retreat and story demands motion. Somewhere beyond the horizon waited the forbidden forest, sealed like a wound, ready to be torn open. The road narrowed until it became more suggestion than path. Fields surrendered to thorn and shadow. The air changed, thickening with resin and ancient wood, and even the wind began moving cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something sleeping. Gilgamesh walked proudly, shoulders squared, tasting the thrill of approaching forbidden ground. Enkidu walked slower, listening to the silence breathe. His instincts recognized sacred danger the way skin recognizes fire. When the cedar forest finally rose before them, it did not look like ordinary wilderness. Trunks stood impossibly tall, dark pillars lifting into a canopy that swallowed sunlight like a clenched fist. The scent of sap clung heavy in the air. But beneath it lived something colder, like stone left too long under deep water. It felt less like entering a place and more like approaching a wound stitched shut by divine hands. They stepped under the first shadow, and their footsteps sounded wrong, swallowed too quickly by the earth. The trees seemed to watch without eyes. Branches overhead interlocked like ribs. Even light behaved strangely here, thinning into pale fragments that refused warmth. Gilgamesh spoke to fill the silence, promising glory, refusing to let dread have the last word. His voice echoed warped and thin, returning to him as something weaker. Enkidu said little. He could feel the forest resisting them without moving. In the wild, danger is honest. Teeth, hunger, pursuit. Here, danger was restraint, a refusal so absolute it bent reality around it. The deeper they stepped, the more the air pressed against their lungs. It felt like walking into judgment, and judgment does not hurry. It waits patiently until you have walked too far to escape. Behind them, the path began to feel uncertain. Trees looked the same from every angle, tall and indifferent, making direction a suggestion rather than truth. Gilgamesh did not look back. Pride does not retreat. Enkidu glanced once and felt a tightness in his ribs, the faint sense of a door closing. The forest was not merely a location. It was a living seal, and seals are not meant to be tested by human hands. As they traveled deeper, the forest began to behave like a mind instead of a place. Birdsong vanished. Insects grew quiet. Even wind seemed reluctant to touch the branches. The silence was not absence, it was restraint, like a predator holding its breath before a strike. The air thickened until breath felt earned. Sap bled from bark in slow amber tears, and the scent clung to skin like memory you cannot wash away. Time moved incorrectly. A short walk felt like hours. A long march felt like minutes. The sun's position above the canopy became uncertain, glimpsed only in pale fragments between branches. Shadows shifted too slowly, then too quickly, as if the forest argued with itself about how daylight should behave. Enkidu's instincts faltered here, stretched thin and confused, because this was not natural wilderness. This was wilderness bound by divine law. At night, their fire burned strangely weak, its light swallowed by darkness that seemed to drink it. Smoke curled upward, only to vanish into the canopy like it was being consumed. Gilgamesh stared into the flame and saw shapes that were not embers, as if the forest used firelight to show him warning without words. Enkidu stared into the black beyond the fire and felt something watching with patient attention, waiting for the correct moment to speak. The third day, or what felt like a third day, brought a change in the forest's voice. The silence became heavier, more deliberate, as if something ahead had finally noticed them fully. Cedar trunks crowded closer together, forcing the brothers into tighter space. Bark brushed their shoulders. Branches creaked like old joints. The forest felt less like scenery, and more like throat walls tightening around intruders. Then the air shifted sharply, cold and sudden, like a hand closing around the spine. Their breath caught, their muscles tightened. Somewhere ahead, something exhaled, and the sound rolled through the trees like warning too deep for language. Gilgamesh's eyes gleamed with hunger. Enkidu's fists clenched with dread. The forest had been silent because it was listening. Now it was answering, and the answer was approaching. The first glimpse was not a full body, but distortion. Reality bending around something massive. Cedar trunks leaned subtly inward, and the air rippled like heat above stone. Enkidu's heart hammered with fear of wrongness rather than fear of death. This presence did not belong to the wilderness. It belonged to enforcement. It felt like law wearing flesh, divine command made tangible. Gilgamesh lifted his chin as if insulted by being warned. A voice rolled out, not quite voice, more like wind forced through bone. It vibrated through teeth and ribs, making the body ache with its weight. The sound did not beg or threaten. It judged. The forest listened like a congregation hearing law. Gilgamesh stepped forward anyway, because kings mistake judgment for challenge. Enkidu followed, because brotherhood had become fate, and fate does not loosen its grip once it tightens. The guardian revealed itself without rushing, as if speed would cheapen its authority. Humbaba stood enormous among shadows, his form broad and immovable, a wall of dread placed here on purpose. His face refused to settle into a single shape. The longer it was watched, the more wrong it became, shifting like sook trapped in a fist. His breath smelled of cedar sap and ancient rot. The forest held still around him like obedience. Gilgamesh tightened his grip on his weapon, excitement sharpening into hunger. Enkidu steadied his stance, skin prickling with instinctive warning. This was not simply an enemy to kill for glory. This was a lock, boundary made flesh, meant to keep mortals away from a sacred wound sealed long before cities existed. If Humbaba fell, something deeper than blood would spill out. Yet both men advanced, because pride refuses retreat. The forest seemed to listen as they approached, every trunk standing like witness, every shadow pressed close with expectation. This was not merely a battle waiting to happen. It was a cosmic test unfolding in silence. Two storms had reached the lock at the world's forbidden door. Gilgamesh raised his weapon. Enkidu flexed his fists. Above the canopy, unseen eyes watched without blinking, and the horror began. Not with screams, but with certainty. Humbaba did not step forward like a man approaching a duel. He occupied the space like a verdict made visible. The cedar trunks stood straighter around him, branches holding still, as if the forest itself obeyed his presence. His body was massive, broad and immovable, a wall of flesh and dread. Gilgamesh felt his blood quicken with a hunter's thrill. Enkidu felt the air thicken in his lungs, warning him too late. The Guardian's face was not simply monstrous, but wrong, as if assembled from fear itself. Features shifted when stared at too long, refusing stable meaning, like smoke trapped in a fist. His eyes burned deep and unreadable, older than mercy. His breath carried cedar sap and ancient rot, heavy enough to taste. Even silence around him had weight, as if the world paused out of respect or fear. He did not feel accidental. He felt designed. The ground beneath him looked bruised, darkened by his presence, as if the earth remembered being stepped on by divine enforcement. When he moved, branches trembled without wind. When he stopped, the forest held still, listening. Enkidu recognized sacred danger in his bones. This was not territory defended by hunger. This was territory defended by law. Humbaba was not guarding trees. He was guarding a rule written into creation itself. Humbaba spoke, and the sound rolled through the forest like wind forced through bone. His voice did not plead, it judged. The words pressed into ribs and teeth, making the body ache. The forest listened, like a congregation receiving law. Gilgamesh mistook the warning for challenge, and smiled. Kings do not understand restraint as virtue. They understand restraint as insult. Enkidu's fists tightened, because he understood the opposite truth. Some doors punish. The air between them vibrated with pressure, like a storm gathering inside a sealed mouth. Gilgamesh stepped forward first, proud, deliberate, weapon raised. Enkidu followed because brotherhood had fused him to the king's path. He could not leave Gilgamesh alone in a sacred place that wanted them dead. Together they approached the lock. Together they tested it. And the forest held its breath, waiting to see what would break. The battle began with no clean opening, only violence arriving through the air itself. Humbaba's presence surged forward, and the pressure struck like invisible hands, shoving at their chests and stealing breath. Gilgamesh staggered back a step, shocked more by resistance than pain. Enkidu planted his feet and refused to move, muscles burning with stubborn will. They were not only fighting a creature, they were fighting divine refusal given weight. Gilgamesh struck first, blade flashing in dim light, cutting through shadow toward flesh. The weapon bit, and for a heartbeat, the impossible happened. Humbaba bled. The blood was dark and thick, smelling of cedar sap and old earth, as if the forest itself had been opened. Gilgamesh's eyes brightened with hungry triumph. If it could bleed, it could die. And if it could die, then no boundary was truly real. He lunged again, seeking proof. Humbaba roared, and the sound shook the cedar trunks like ribs rattling under impact. His arms swung slow but unstoppable, landing like falling stone. Enkidu was thrown sideways, hitting bark hard enough to see stars behind his eyes. Gilgamesh rolled away, barely escaping a blow that would have crushed him into soil. Fear entered them both now, not soft fear, but sharpened urgency. Fear became fuel. Their bodies moved faster because stopping meant death. Enkidu slammed his fists into the Guardian's side, impact heavy and brutal. He fought like wilderness itself, close, relentless, refusing space. Gilgamesh fought like a king, strategic, commanding, striking for weakness. Their movements began to synchronize, violence turning into dark choreography. Two storms learned to move as one. Breath matched breath. Strike answered strike. Brotherhood became weapon, and fate tightened around them like rope. The forest watched without moving. It did not sway like spectators. It held still like witnesses at an execution. Every time Humbaba bled, the air grew colder, as if the world mourned the injury. Every time the brothers pressed forward, silence thickened, as if gods leaned closer. This was not merely combat. This was violation unfolding in real time. And once violation begins, the only question left is how far it goes. Humbaba faltered, and the moment felt unnatural, like watching the sun hesitate. His massive body swayed and branches cracked beneath his shifting weight. Blood ran down him in dark streaks, staining earth that had never been stained by mortal hands. Gilgamesh felt triumph surge like fire. Enkidu felt dread sharpen into certainty. A guardian placed by gods is not meant to fall. If it falls, it changes the world. The lock breaks, and the door behind it opens. Humbaba's voice lowered, no longer booming, but deep with urgent warning. It did not sound like begging in the human sense. It sounded like law tightening into desperation. Enkidu hesitated and reached toward Gilgamesh's arm for a heartbeat, instinct screaming caution. Killing Humbaba felt like tearing out a lock while pressure still waited behind the door. But Gilgamesh shook him off. Kings do not stop when victory is within reach. Victory is their religion. The blade fell, and Humbaba shuddered as if the forest itself had been struck. The Guardian collapsed, enormous and final, and the earth accepted him like a grave, swallowing something that should have remained standing. The cedar forest exhaled a long, hollow sound. Not relief, but shock. Silence flooded the world so completely, it felt like a spell. Even wind refused to move. Even shadows seemed to freeze, holding their breath. Gilgamesh stood over the fallen guardian, chest heaving, staring at the impossible corpse like proof he had surpassed the gods. Enkidu stared into the trees, waiting for immediate punishment. But punishment did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as absence. The forest did not rage. It did not scream. It simply went quiet, in a way that felt intelligent, like a body deciding how to respond to infection. That quiet tasted worse than any roar. They began cutting cedar trees, taking timber as trophy, and each strike sounded too loud, echoing like blasphemy. Sap bled bright and slow, and the scent grew heavier until it made the throat ache. The forest did not resist. It endured. Endurance felt worse than resistance, because endurance suggests patience, and patient things remember. When they finally turned to leave, the silence followed them like a curse, and Enkidu felt the world mark him for payment. The journey back began with silence, clinging tighter than sweat. The cedar timber they carried should have felt like triumph, proof of conquest, proof that gods could be bled. Instead, it felt like stolen bones taken from a grave that still remembered its dead. Gilgamesh walked proudly at first, shoulders high, but even his confidence moved cautiously, as if it sensed something watching from behind. Victory should feel loud. This victory felt muted, wrong. The forest did not chase them. That was the first wrongness. No roar followed, no storm rose, no beasts attacked in vengeance. Cedar trunks stood still, holding shadows close, and the air remained unnaturally quiet. A place that should have screamed simply withheld sound, as if the world had chosen not to react yet. Enkidu felt dread coil tighter with every mile. Delayed punishment is always worse than immediate punishment. Time began behaving normally again, but normality felt suspicious. Birds returned gradually, hesitant and distant. Wind moved more freely, yet felt cold against skin, like fingers counting ribs. Gilgamesh looked back once and narrowed his eyes, refusing to show doubt. He saw only trees shrinking into the horizon, yet he felt it. Something sealed had been opened. A sacred lock lay dead behind them, and the world would not remain unchanged. At night, their fire burned bright under open sky, but comfort did not follow. Shadows looked sharper, as if the darkness had learned to watch. Gilgamesh spoke of glory, forcing certainty into the air like a command, yet his voice sounded strained, thinner than before. Enkidu listened and said little, replaying the Guardian's fall again and again, hunting for the exact moment they crossed the line that could not be uncrossed. When Uruk's walls finally rose in the distance, the cedar timber felt less like prize and more like evidence. Gilgamesh smiled, but the smile held tension. Enkidu's chest tightened with strange sorrow, as if he already knew the return would not be reunion. Triumph had been achieved, yet the air tasted wrong. The gods had not spoken. That silence was not mercy. It was a weapon waiting to strike in its own time. Uruk welcomed them with noise, because cities are loud when they want to hide fear. People flooded streets shouting praise, pointing at cedar timber like sunlight dragged down to earth. Priests raised hymns, merchants offered gifts, children ran close enough to stare before mothers pulled them back. The city called them heroes, because heroes are easier to worship than consequences. Celebration filled the air like smoke meant to blind. Gilgamesh accepted the praise as if it were his natural due. He stood tall, chest lifted, eyes bright, letting worship pour over him like warm oil. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted. The Guardian's death had been too sacred. The forest's silence afterward had been too deliberate. A splinter of doubt lived behind his ribs, and he buried it under laughter, because kings do not survive by admitting fear. Enkidu stood beside him and felt the joy scrape against his skin. The people's praise did not reach his heart. He looked at the cedar timber and remembered sap bleeding like slow blood. He listened to hymns and heard warning beneath them. The wilderness inside him recognized truth. Sacred places punish theft. Uruk celebrated theft as victory. The city's pride felt like inviting a curse to sit at the table and be served first. The elders praised the brothers, yet their eyes did not fully smile. They understood greatness always casts a shadow. Priests burned incense thicker than before, hands trembling as if smoke could hide guilt from heaven. Uruk's walls felt sturdy and triumphant, but walls do not stop gods. Walls do not stop law. The city's pride swelled outward, and swelling is dangerous. A body that swells is a body preparing to burst. That night, feasts filled the palace with wine meant to drown memory. Gilgamesh laughed louder than necessary. Enkidu ate without hunger. Outside, lamps glowed, and the city pretended safety was real again. Yet behind the celebration, silence waited beyond sight. The gods had not raged like humans rage. They had watched like immune systems watch infection, and now the world was preparing its correction. The gods did not respond with thunder. Humans believe divinity reacts like wounded pride, loud and immediate. But the gods reacted like immune systems. They detected rupture and moved to contain it. Humbaba had been placed as a seal, a lock guarding a sacred wound. Now that lock lay dead, and the breach could not be ignored. Balance demanded closure, and closure demanded sacrifice. Divine law reasserts itself through flesh, not argument. Somewhere in the unseen silence, a name was chosen to bear consequence, not out of hatred, but necessity. Gilgamesh's blood was divine, thick with protection. Enkidu's blood was earth and intention made as counterweight. He had been shaped to oppose excess, to restore balance. Now he would be used again, this time as payment. A weight must match what was stolen. A life must seal what was opened. Enkidu felt it before priests spoke. A chill crept into his bones during the feast, sudden as cold metal pressed to skin. He turned his head and thought he saw something watching from a corner, but there was nothing there, only shadow. Yet instinct screamed certainty. The gods had noticed him. Their attention is heavier than chains. It does not need hands to restrain you. It simply decides your ending. The first signs arrived like sickness and ended like prophecy. Enkidu woke with heaviness in his limbs, breath thick, chest tightened like a fist closing. He tried to stand and swayed, weakness shocking him like insult. His muscles felt delayed, as if flesh hesitated to obey. The change did not feel natural. It felt deliberate, like invisible scribes erasing him line by line. His body was being unwritten. Gilgamesh noticed and laughed once, calling it fatigue, calling it the cost of travel. Then Enkidu's eyes darkened, and his skin lost warmth, and the king's laughter died. Uruk began whispering again, fear returning to doorways like a familiar guest. The cedar timber suddenly looked cursed. Victory had come home wrapped in gold, but gold cannot hide rot. Destiny hardened into law, and Enkidu carried the mark. Payment had begun. Uruk's celebration thinned after the forest, but pride still lived in the palace like heat trapped under stone. Gilgamesh stood taller than ever, wearing victory-like armor, refusing to admit the silence behind it. Enkidu's strange illness lurked in the edges of the city's breath, yet the king's confidence only sharpened. Strength unpunished becomes arrogance, and arrogance attracts divine attention. The world had begun correcting itself, but the king kept pushing against correction. It was then that Ishtar turned her gaze upon him, and the air changed like weather before fire. Ishtar was goddess of love and war, beauty armed with dominion, and she moved like something that owned the concept of desire. Her skin shone as if moonlight lived beneath it, and her hair fell dark and thick like spilled ink. Jewelry clung to her throat and wrists like captured starlight, each piece a quiet reminder of divine possession. Her presence made men forget how to breathe. Priests bowed instinctively because gods do not ask. They claim. Perfume followed her, sweet enough to feel dangerous, layered over a faint metallic scent like blood hiding under flowers. Her eyes were bright and steady, too vast for mortal comfort, and her smile carried hunger that did not bother pretending it was gentle. She did not appear to admire Gilgamesh. She appeared to take interest in owning him. When she spoke, her voice was silk drawn across steel. She offered him glory beyond kingship, eternal authority, sacred wealth, power sealed by divinity. To humans it would sound like love, but gods do not love the way humans love. Her desire was conquest disguised as affection, ownership disguised as invitation. She wanted Gilgamesh not as partner, but as property, her chosen instrument, her proof that even kings kneel. Gilgamesh stared back without lowering his head. He did not tremble. He did not soften. Something in him refused to be claimed, not from virtue, but from pride too large to fit beneath another power. In that moment, he did something truly dangerous. He rejected a goddess's narrative over his life. Refusing Ishtar was not insulting a woman. It was denying a god's right to write his story. His refusal did not come quietly. Gilgamesh spoke of Ishtar's past lovers, names carried like warnings through temples and songs. Men she had adored and destroyed, devotion repaid with ruin. His words were sharp and public, cutting deeper because they were true. The crowd froze. To insult a goddess is not merely arrogance. It is blasphemy spoken into open air, daring the sky to strike back and prove its power. Ishtar's face remained beautiful, but beauty can sharpen like a blade. Her eyes hardened until they looked like polished stone. Her smile thinned, and the sweetness in the air curdled into something poisonous. Love in her always carried teeth. Now the teeth showed. The goddess of desire turned effortlessly into the goddess of warfare, and that effortless shift was terrifying. A god can turn tenderness into apocalypse without changing posture. She stepped back, not in retreat, but in decision. Her pride did not break into tears. It collapsed into certainty. A goddess does not suffer humiliation the way humans suffer it. She translates humiliation into punishment. Gilgamesh had refused her claim, and refusal is unbearable to divinity. If he would not be owned by love, he would be crushed by war. Her rejection became cosmic, rewriting the city's future through violence. Ishtar rose toward Thun, the heavens like dark fire. Jewelry flashed like small blades. Her hair streamed behind her, and her presence left the palace colder than before. Priests fell to their knees, begging forgiveness they could not purchase. The air tasted like thunder waiting. Gilgamesh stood still, eyes bright, refusing regret. Enkidu, already shadowed by sickness, felt dread tighten like a noose. The gods had been watching. Now, a goddess had become an enemy. Above, Ishtar demanded the bull of heaven as retribution, a punishment shaped into flesh and force. Her voice cracked through unseen halls like a whip striking stone. The divine order listened, not because it agreed, but because it obeyed. Uruk had broken sacred law, slain divine guardian, rejected divine claim. Now punishment would become spectacle. The city below continued living in fragile ignorance, unaware disaster was descending. The bull of heaven fell from the sky, like apocalypse given hooves. The ground buckled when it struck, and dust erupted as if the earth itself had been punched. Walls trembled. Streets cracked. People screamed and ran, but running meant nothing against a divine beast built for devastation. The bull was enormous, hide black as storm clouds, muscles rolling beneath it like moving stone. Its horns curved upward like crescents sharpened for sacrifice. Its eyes burned with unnatural light, empty of animal thought and full of divine intent. Each breath smelled of dust and death. When it charged, it did not move like a beast hunting food. It moved like judgment delivered with weight. Hooves shattered brick like brittle bone. Houses collapsed. Bodies vanished beneath falling walls. Temples cracked. Priests screamed prayers into air that did not listen. Uruk became an altar, and citizens became offerings, scattered across stone. Gilgamesh rushed into the destruction with weapon raised, refusing to be smaller than catastrophe. Enkidu followed, despite sickness, loyalty dragging him forward like chain. They fought the bull in the streets among crushed bodies and broken walls. Gilgamesh struck deep into its flank. Enkidu seized its tail, muscles screaming, and wrenched with brutal force. The beast bellowed, shaking the world, but the brothers did not loosen. Two storms moved as one. When the bull finally fell, it did not look like victory. It looked like disaster finally running out of strength. The streets trembled with the aftermath, dust, smoke, and shattered stone hanging in the air like a curse that refused to settle. Gilgamesh stood over the fallen beast, chest heaving, pride rising again despite the ruin around him. In a final insult, he claimed a trophy from the defeat and lifted it high, mocking the heavens openly. The city did not cheer. Too much had been lost. Fear returned, heavier than ever. And above, the gods' correction tightened. That night, Enkidu's fever rose like a curse climbing bone. He lay sweating, breath uneven, eyes unfocused, as if invisible hands were pulling threads out of his flesh. Gilgamesh sat beside him, silent, watching helplessly. The king could kill monsters and divine beasts, but he could not kill consequence. The bull's death sealed the price. The gods had been patient, but patience ends. Enkidu was chosen to pay. The sickness did not behave like ordinary illness. It moved through Enkidu like something deliberate, as if invisible hands were tightening around his body in slow increments. His skin burned with fever, then went cold without warning. Sweat soaked the sheets, yet his mouth stayed dry, tongue heavy like stone. His breath came uneven, as if air itself resisted entering him. Gilgamesh watched from nearby, silent, realizing strength meant nothing here. Enkidu's body, once carved from wilderness certainty, began to feel distant, delayed, as if it no longer belonged fully to him. His hands trembled when he tried to grip. His legs weakened when he tried to stand. The insult of fragility struck him harder than pain. In the wild, injury was honest. Blood, bruise, recovery, or death. This unraveling felt wrong. It felt like the world rewriting him sentence by sentence, erasing what made him himself. Fever dreams crawled behind his eyes like insects. He saw the cedar forest again, silent and watching, its towering trunks unmoving as graves. He saw Humbaba's shifting face, wrong and endless, and felt the guardian's breath in his mouth like rot. He saw the bull of heaven's burning eyes, staring through smoke. Every victory returned as horror. The deeper his fever went, the more the past sharpened into punishment. Sometimes he felt gods, standing just out of sight, close enough to sense, impossible to confront. They did not strike him with visible weapons. They pressed on him with presence. Their silence bruised his mind like pressure bruises fruit. Enkidu tried to lunge at them in dreams, tried to scream, but his voice failed, swallowed by unseen hands. He woke gasping, heart pounding, the chamber spinning, and knew he was being watched into death. Outside the palace, Uruk moved carefully, as if even noise might offend the air. Priests burned incense and sheep, filling temples with sook and trembling hymns. People whispered about payment, about sacred law, about the king's battles bringing apocalypse. Enkidu lay burning and weakening, and the city felt his suffering like warning carved into stone. The wrong victory had ripened into consequence, and consequence had begun to feed. Enkidu's anger rose like poison seeking an exit. Some days he cursed the gods, spitting rage at the ceiling as if heaven might flinch. Other days he lay silent, staring without focus, as if already half gone. His moods shifted like storm clouds, fury and sorrow colliding. Gilgamesh spoke of offerings and temples, promising bargains no god would accept. The king's voice carried strain, because he was learning the truth kings hate most. Commands cannot move fate. In one bitter surge, Enkidu cursed Shamhat, voice hoarse as dry earth. He blamed her for drawing him into the city, for taking the wild from him, for making him human enough to suffer. Gilgamesh flinched at the name, but did not defend her aloud. Pain needs a target, and humans always strike what is nearest, rather than what is true. Yet even as the curse left Enkidu's mouth, it sounded wrong, as if the words did not fit. Then his voice broke, and something raw entered it. Grief. He admitted the truth he could barely bear. The curse was not her. The curse was being alive at all, being given breath only to have it taken. Becoming human had been exile. Exile had brought meaning, and meaning had brought suffering. Enkidu had lost Eden, gained brotherhood, then been sentenced to die for a rule he did not write. His tears came harsh and strangled. The dreams deepened, turning into prophecy. Enkidu saw a dark house beneath the earth, a place where dust settled on everything like ash. Shadows moved there, weak and hungry, wearing shapes that used to be men. Their eyes were empty. Their mouths were silent. He felt them reaching for him, not with hands, but with need. The underworld called him the way a grave calls soil inward, slow and unavoidable. The vision horrified him more than pain. Gilgamesh began breaking in quieter ways. His rage had nowhere to land, so it turned inward and became panic. He threatened priests, shouted at servants, demanded remedies no one could provide. The palace walls held his voice, but could not contain the truth spreading beneath it. He was losing control. The mighty ruler of Uruk, who bent men like reeds, could not bend death. Watching Enkidu weaken taught him humiliation at the root of existence. The final days arrived without dramatic announcement. Enkidu simply grew thinner in spirit, as if his soul had begun stepping away first. One morning, he stared at his hands for a long time, flexing his fingers slowly, whispering about animals who no longer knew his scent. His voice sounded dull, exhausted. Anger requires energy. Death had stolen his energy piece by piece. What remained was quiet awareness, heavy as stone. Shamhat came to the palace, summoned by rumor and guilt. She entered with her head high, but her eyes darkened by fear. Enkidu looked at her, and for a moment Gilgamesh expected fury to rise again. Instead, Enkidu's gaze softened into something painful. He saw her not as enemy, but as the doorway he could never close again. She had given him humanity. Humanity had given him brotherhood. Brotherhood had given him grief worth dying for. Enkidu spoke to her in a voice rough and low, telling her he cursed her because pain demanded somewhere to land. He said he understood now she was not the cruelty. The cruelty was existence, and the gods who shape lives like clay, and break them when balance demands. Shamhat wept silently, her tears falling like late offerings. Enkidu reached for her hand briefly, then let it fall, because even comfort becomes heavy near death. That night, Enkidu's breath changed. It grew slow and thin, as if each inhale cost more than it returned. His eyes stared into darkness without focusing, already seeing something beyond the room. Gilgamesh leaned close, gripping his brother's hand, whispering his name like command and prayer combined. The king's fingers trembled despite him, because divine blood does not stop grief. It only deepens the emptiness when grief cannot be prevented. The final breath came quietly. Enkidu's chest rose once, then did not rise again. His mouth parted slightly, as if beginning a word that would never finish. His eyes emptied into stillness. The room felt colder instantly, as if life leaving him stole heat from the air. Gilgamesh froze, then broke. His grief was not noble. It was animal. He clutched Enkidu's body and cried out, realizing even giants are only meat. And if Enkidu could die, so could he. The days after Enkidu's death did not move like days. They dragged themselves across Uruk like wounded animals, slow and refusing to die. The city continued its ordinary noises: water jars, market calls, sandals on stone. Yet to Gilgamesh, it all felt distant, muffled behind grief. He walked through his own halls as if they belonged to another man, touching pillars and door frames to confirm the world remained solid. Rumor reached him like smoke slipping beneath a door. Men spoke of a name carried on caravan tongues and riverboat whispers: Utnapishtim, the deathless flood survivor, granted eternal life by the gods. The name did not arrive as story. It arrived as oxygen. Gilgamesh heard it and felt his lungs fill for the first time since Enkidu's final breath left his body. Hope, sharp and dangerous, returned like a blade. He repeated the name beneath his tongue as if it were a spell. Utnapishtim, Utnapishtim, a man who had crossed death and returned untouched, a man who had outlived disaster and still kept breath. If such a being existed, then death was not a wall. It was a door, and if there was a door, there was a way through, even if it tore skin from bone and left him bleeding in the dark. Counselors begged him to remain. Priests offered rites meant to soothe mourning into obedience. Citizens feared another kind of tyranny would rise from this grief, sharper and less human. Gilgamesh listened to none of it. Enkidu had been the weight that kept his spirit from tipping into madness, and now the balance was gone. In its place grew one thought, singular and cruel. I will not end like this. He ordered provisions without ceremony and weapons without pride. The crown remained, but it felt like a dead thing pressing against his brow. He left Uruk not as a ruler riding out in splendor, but as a man fleeing a shadow that followed too closely. Behind him, the city watched with the helpless awe reserved for disasters. Ahead of him, the road stretched into myth, and the name burned brighter than the sun. The world beyond Uruk offered no comfort. It gave him heat that pressed against his skull like a divine palm, and dust that coated his tongue until swallowing tasted like ash. Wind scraped his skin, dry and unsympathetic. Each step away from stone walls felt like stepping deeper into a place where humans were not meant to survive long, as if the earth itself had decided to measure him and find him wanting. He crossed plains bleached pale as bone. He walked through ravines where riverbeds lay split open like empty throats. At times he found carcasses half buried in sand, goats, wolves, men, stripped down to shapes that looked almost peaceful in their stillness. The sight did not turn his stomach. It hardened him. Death was everywhere, and that only proved his hunger was necessary. He would not lie down among them. Hunger arrived first like irritation, then like instruction. He ate what he carried until supplies dwindled, then gnawed at whatever could be forced into sustenance. Roots, bitter leaves, small animals caught with brutal hands. Thirst followed, worse than hunger, tightening his throat until breath felt stolen. His body, vast and powerful, became a furnace with no water to cool it. Divine blood did not stop thirst. It only made thirst louder. At night he lay beneath stars that looked sharp enough to pierce skin. Sleep came in fragments, and in those fragments the dead returned. Sometimes Enkidu stood at the edge of vision, silent, watching with a calm that felt like accusation. Sometimes Gilgamesh saw his own corpse laid out on stone, eyes open, mouth dried, the same stillness he had feared now waiting for him. He woke, shaking, then walked again. The landscape grew harsher, more symbolic, as though the world was shedding softness on purpose. The farther he traveled, the more the air began to feel unnatural, thin and strangely still, heavy with pressure that did not belong to weather. He sensed a boundary ahead where mortal roads stopped pretending they continued. He pushed forward anyway, because grief was no longer behind him. Grief had become the whip in his hand, and he obeyed it. He reached the boundary without seeing a wall. There was no cliff, no river of fire, no gate carved with warnings. The edge arrived as sensation, the sudden wrongness of distance, the sense that the horizon had become a lie. The air tasted stale, as if sealed away for ages. Wind moved slowly, deliberately, like breath held in a closed mouth. Even the light felt thinner, stretched like skin over something deeper. The ground beneath his feet changed, packed tight as if pressed by countless ancient steps. The sky overhead remained blue, yet it carried no warmth, only a fragile brightness that seemed ready to tear. Gilgamesh paused once, not from caution, but recognition. This place was not meant to be reached. It was a seam in the world, stitched shut long ago. He had placed his hands on the thread, and the thread had begun to tremble. Warnings came without words. Shadows shifted when he was not looking. Small stones vibrated faintly, as if something deep below had turned in sleep. Insects fell silent. The hairs along his arms lifted as though a storm approached, yet the sky stayed clear. It was the wrong kind of warning, the kind that does not say danger is coming, but says danger has already noticed you and begun to decide. Still he walked on. He had crossed forbidden ground before and lived. He had stood beneath divine wrath and refused to bow. What was another boundary, another line the gods expected him to respect? Yet as he stepped farther, his confidence thinned. Not from fear of dying, but from fear of meaning. If the world had an edge, what waited beyond it did not need to obey flesh, law, or mercy. Shapes appeared ahead as silhouettes against unnatural stillness. They did not emerge from behind anything. They were simply there, as if the world had stopped hiding them. Gilgamesh's heart slowed, not with calm, but with instinct recognizing judgment. He did not draw his weapon, because weapons felt irrelevant. This was not a fight. This was assessment. The road had ended, and the guardians posted at its end had turned their gaze upon him. They stepped forward, and the illusion of statues dissolved. They were the Scorpion Man and his wife, appointed wardens of the gates of Shamash at the mountains of Mashu, where the sun descends each night into earth and rises again at dawn. Human in torso, yet terrible in presence, their lower bodies gleamed with segmented scorpion armor, tails arched like poised judgments. They guarded not territory, but transition. Gilgamesh felt it at once. These were not creatures to be challenged. They were boundary-made flesh. The Scorpion Man's gaze burned like banked coals, ancient and measuring. His wife stood beside him, equally vast, equally still. her silence more severe than speech. Together they had watched the sun's passage since the first morning. Few mortals stood before them and remained whole. When the Scorpion Man spoke, the sound did not belong to a throat alone. It seemed to rise from the mountain itself, vibrating through stone and bone alike. He did not ask for name or title. He asked who Gilgamesh was, beneath crown and lineage. What force had driven him to the seam of the world, where even divine light bows to order? Gilgamesh answered without adornment. He spoke of Enkidu's stillness, of flesh cooling into clay, of breath departing and not returning. He confessed fear without disguise. He did not seek glory or conquest. He sought escape from extinction. His grief stood bare before them, stripped of pride. It was not ambition that had brought him here, but refusal. The Scorpion wife regarded him long, sensing the truth within the fracture. They had seen kings arrive swollen with vanity, demanding eternity as privilege. This was different. Grief had made him smaller in arrogance and larger in desperation. At last they allowed passage, warning of the sun's tunnel through Mashu, darkness measured in leagues where light and time unravel. He stepped forward, and the gate yielded. The gate opened without sound, not swinging like wood, but parting like shadow giving way. Cold spilled out, carrying the scent of sealed stone and ancient fear. Gilgamesh stepped forward, and the daylight behind him did not fade. It died, extinguished as if a hand had closed around the sun. Darkness struck him thick and immediate, pressing against his skin like deep water swallowing breath. The first league stole his sight so completely, it felt like being erased. The tunnel offered no horizon, no ceiling, no proof of space, only the scrape of his breath and the dull shock of footsteps. The second and third leagues stole direction. He could not tell if he walked straight or turned, only that the air stayed heavy, and the dark refused to change. The fourth, fifth, and sixth leagues stole time. Moments folded inward, repeating like a curse spoken in circles. Silence became a language designed to weaken him, and grief rose sharper inside that emptiness. The tunnel fed on it, swelling with the taste of pain. He heard Enkidu's name in the black, as if the stone whispered it, then heard the absence after, so vast it made him choke. The seventh, eighth, and ninth leagues stole certainty. The tunnel pressed visions into his senses like judgment carved into flesh, cedar resin thick in his throat, sacred trunks split open, Uruk's labor lines bending under his command, faces turned away in fear, faces lowered in obedience. He saw Enkidu again, not accusing, not forgiving, only watching, as if the dead waited to see whether grief would finally break the living. The 10th and 11th leagues stole his body. His legs grew heavy, as though stone had been poured into his bones. His throat burned with every breath, the air too cold, too ancient, too unwilling to be shared. Strength became meaningless here. No blade could cut exhaustion. Then the 12th league stole his voice entirely, swallowing sound before it existed, until a faint seam of dimness appeared ahead, like a wound opening. The seam of dimness widened as Gilgamesh approached, and the darkness behind him did not chase. It simply remained, patient, as if it knew he would return to it eventually. The faint light ahead felt wrong. Not warm like daybreak, but pale and bloodless, like illumination stolen from a corpse. He stepped through, blinking against radiance that did not comfort the eyes, and felt the air change texture. Behind him, the tunnel sealed itself into silence. No echo followed him out. No wind escaped. The passage behaved like a mouth closing after swallowing. Gilgamesh stood unmoving for a moment, chest rising and falling hard, his body shaking from the strain of surviving what should not be survived. His divine blood did not feel triumphant. It felt scraped raw, as if the darkness had peeled away everything unnecessary. The light revealed a place that should not have existed so close to that black corridor. There was no gradual transition, no gentle slope from ruin into relief. It was simply there, an impossible openness, like a dream stitched onto the edge of a nightmare. Gilgamesh stared into it, suspicious of every shape, every breath of air, every hint of color, because the world had taught him that beauty often hid teeth. He took a step forward, then another, and the ground held him steady. The air smelled faintly sweet, like crushed fruit and distant smoke. After the tunnel's dead coldness, this felt almost alive, and that life unsettled him more than death had. He realized he was searching for the next trial, the next guardian, the next violence. Peace felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things had always been dangerous in stories like his. Even so, he moved onward, because stopping meant letting the darkness behind him become the only truth. He refused that. Grief still drove him like a nail through the chest, pinning him to motion. Enkidu's absence pressed harder now that the tunnel had stripped him bare. He did not feel stronger for surviving the leagues. He felt emptier, and emptiness had become the fuel of his quest. He emerged into a garden growing where no mortal garden should exist, suspended between darkness and an unseen sea. The light here was cold radiance, like moonlight trapped inside glass. Trees rose with branches heavy in strange fruit that shimmered as if jeweled from within. Leaves caught the pale glow like hammered bronze, and flowers opened in perfect silence, too vivid and intentional to be natural. The beauty did not comfort him. It felt arranged, like bait placed carefully for desperate creatures. The air smelled sweet and thick, perfume heavy enough to soften thought. For a moment his body wanted to kneel, to rest beneath shining branches, and let grief dissolve into numbness. The garden whispered that surrender could be mercy, that forgetting could be relief, that pain was a burden he no longer needed to carry. Gilgamesh stepped forward instead, because he recognized temptation when it touched his tongue. Forgetting Enkidu would not heal him. It would hollow him. It would make his love small, and he refused to let love become small. Grief was the last sacred thing left in him, the last proof that something real had been taken. Even pain was loyalty. Even suffering was devotion to what mattered. As he moved through the garden, the fruit seemed to watch him. The light shifted strangely, never brightening into warmth, only reflecting like metal. He felt unseen eyes measuring his hunger, weighing whether he would trade meaning for comfort. His hands itched to seize the jeweled fruit and force it into his mouth like stolen salvation. But he did not. He passed through beauty as if it were smoke. At the far end, the sound of water reached him. Slow, heavy, endless. The garden ended abruptly, as though even beauty refused to approach what waited beyond. Gilgamesh stopped at the edge and listened. feeling the air grow colder with each step closer. He understood then that the tunnel had not been the final boundary. It had only been the corridor leading to a greater one. The sea lay black beneath the cold radiance, unmoving as if it held its breath. It did not glitter or roll with waves. It looked thick as oil, swallowing light without reflection. The air above it was colder, heavier, and filled with silence so complete it felt deliberate, enforced, as though even sound had been forbidden to cross. Gilgamesh stared and felt the boundary in his bones. He stepped closer, and instinct tightened in him like a fist. This water was not merely deep, it was sealed, not guarded by spears, but by consequence. It was the kind of boundary the gods used to keep mortals in their cages. He remembered Enkidu's dread at forbidden ground, and the memory sharpened into warning. But Gilgamesh did not step back. He had already sacrificed too much to retreat now. He searched the shoreline like a man searching for cracks in a prison wall. His feet sank into damp sand that felt too cold, too ancient, as if it had never known sunlight. He looked for boats, for oars, for any mark of passage. At first there was nothing, only the sea and the quiet weight of impossibility pressing against his ribs. The water waited without emotion, certain of victory. Desperation rose in him again, but it was hollow now, burned clean of pride. He clenched his fists with the urge to strike the sea, to punish it for existing, to command it to part like an obedient subject. But this water did not know kings. It would kill him without hatred, without mercy, without even noticing his name. That indifference frightened him more than wrath ever had. Then far along the shore he saw a small structure lit with ordinary fire, smoke rising thin and human against the vastness. The sight felt wrong, comfort placed too close to doom, like a candle burning beside a grave. Gilgamesh walked toward it anyway, because he had learned that even traps could become tools. If the world offered a door, he would force it open. The dwelling stood with its door facing the sea, as if it had been built to watch the boundary forever. Warm light spilled through cracks in the walls, trembling like breath. Gilgamesh approached and smelled something human: bread, wine, hearth smoke, and the scent struck him with sudden violence. It reminded him that ordinary life still existed, that people still ate and laughed without staring into the edges of the world. Inside, Siduri looked up and froze. She saw a giant shaped like disaster standing in her doorway, dust-coated and hollow-eyed, grief clinging to him like a second skin. He did not look like a king anymore. He looked like a corpse that refused to lie down. Fear sharpened her movements. She slammed the door and locked it, as if wood could defend her against myth stepping too close. Through the closed door, she demanded to know what he was, voice tight and trembling. Gilgamesh answered with urgency that sounded like madness wearing purpose. He demanded the path to Utnapishtim, as if demanding could change the world's laws. His words struck the door like blows, because his body had forgotten how to ask gently. For a moment, Siduri said nothing, and silence weighed more than refusal. Slowly she opened the door a fraction, letting firelight cut across his face. She studied him like a woman studying a storm, measuring whether it would destroy her if invited inside. She saw grief and defiance braided together, and she understood the danger was not only his strength, but his refusal to accept an ending. Her fear shifted into something colder, recognition of fate walking on human legs. Siduri spoke carefully, not welcoming, not cruel. She told him he had wandered too far for any mortal comfort to save him now. She told him that men who chase immortality often become monsters before they ever find their answer. Gilgamesh listened without blinking, because he did not care what he became. The only horror he feared was ending. The only monster he refused to meet was death itself. Siduri told him to eat, to drink, to wash the dust from his skin. She told him to hold joy while it lived, to love while breath remained in the body, to build and teach and keep his people close. The words sounded simple, almost insulting beside the cosmic terror he carried. Yet she spoke them with seriousness that made them heavy. She offered the human truth like a shield, not a comfort. She told him death could not be defeated. It could only be endured. The gods had written it into flesh the way scribes pressed wedges into clay, permanent and unforgiving. Kings die the same as beggars. Giants rot the same as children. Siduri spoke as though she had watched lifetimes collapse like candles extinguished, one by one. And her voice carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who has stopped asking the sky for mercy. Gilgamesh rejected her wisdom immediately. Acceptance felt like betrayal. If he ate and drank, and returned to ordinary life, then Enkidu would remain dead forever, sealed behind the same boundary waiting for him. Siduri's truth asked him to live small, but Gilgamesh's fear had grown too large. He could not shrink himself back into human comfort. Not yet. His grief had become a blade, and he could not sheath it. Siduri did not argue. She only watched him with pity that did not soften her eyes. Then she offered direction anyway, because she understood refusing him would change nothing. She told him there was one path left across the sea's law, Shanabi, the ferryman who could cross the waters of death. Her voice lowered as she spoke the name, as if speaking it too loudly might draw the water's attention. Gilgamesh rose the moment he heard it, driven by the same hunger that had carried him through wasteland and darkness. Siduri watched him go, knowing she had not saved him, only redirected him. As he stepped back into cold radiance, she whispered a small prayer meant for ordinary travelers, even though he was no longer ordinary. Gilgamesh did not look back. He walked toward the ferryman's name like fate pulling him by the throat. Gilgamesh left Siduri's fire behind and returned to the shoreline where the sea waited, black and unmoving. The wind carried no salt, only cold, as if the water had never belonged to weather. He repeated the name she had given him like a charm against despair. Shanabi. The sound felt thin in his mouth, but it was direction, and direction was survival. Without it, grief would become a circle with no exit. He walked along the coast, scanning for any sign of life, any interruption in the shoreline's emptiness. The sand grew darker the farther he went, damp and heavy underfoot. The sky above remained pale and indifferent, yet the air felt watched, as though unseen eyes followed his steps. His heart beat slowly now, exhausted, but his mind remained sharp with one thought: find the ferryman, or die here where even gods would not bother to look. At last he saw something unnatural among the rocks. A vessel pulled high onto shore, its shape sharp against the dimness. It looked too old to trust, yet too intact to be abandoned. Nearby stood a figure, still as a carved post, watching the sea as if he listened to it speak. Gilgamesh approached, towering over sand and stone, and the figure did not move away. He did not bow either. That alone told Gilgamesh this was no ordinary man. Urshanabi turned slowly, and his gaze met Gilgamesh without flinching. His face was lined with age, but the lines did not soften him. They hardened him, like rope worn tight through years of strain. He looked not like a servant waiting for command, but like a man who had carried the law of death so long he no longer feared kings. Gilgamesh felt anger rise at that calm, then felt the anger collapse into need. "I seek Utnapishtim," Gilgamesh said, and his voice sounded rough, scraped raw by travel and grief. The words carried no pride, only hunger. Urshanabi studied him in silence, as if reading something beneath the speech. Then he looked back to the sea, not impressed. "Many seek him," he said at last, voice quiet as stone. "Few survive what lies between." Gilgamesh stepped closer, impatience sharpening again like a returning habit. "Then take me," he demanded, as if the sea were a road and the ferryman a soldier. Urshanabi's eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear but warning. He told Gilgamesh that the waters ahead were death itself, and the crossing demanded ritual precision. One mistake would not be punished with pain. It would be punished with ending. Gilgamesh listened, but his grief made obedience difficult. He saw only distance between himself and the Deathless One, and distance made him furious. The boat, the shoreline, the silence, all of it felt like obstruction. He moved toward the vessel as if to claim it, and his massive hands brushed strange objects near the hull. Stone-like things arranged with care, dark and smooth, almost alive in their stillness. Urshanabi snapped a warning, but it came too late. Gilgamesh, impatient and blind with need, struck the stone things aside. They shattered against the rocks with a sound like bones breaking. For a moment, the air itself seemed to pause. The sea remained still, yet the silence grew heavier, as if something unseen had leaned closer. Gilgamesh felt a sudden chill crawl through him, the sick understanding that he had broken something that mattered. Urshanabi's face tightened into anger colder than rage. He did not shout. He did not threaten. His fury was controlled, disciplined, the kind that comes from years of serving a law that never bends. He told Gilgamesh those stone things were sacred instruments of passage, shaped to protect the boat from the water's touch. Now they were ruined. The crossing would be harder, longer, sharper. Gilgamesh had made his own road more lethal. For a heartbeat, Gilgamesh expected violence. He expected the ferryman to draw a blade or call gods down upon him. But Urshanabi only stared, and the stare held judgment. "You are strong," he said quietly, "and still you break what you do not understand." The words struck Gilgamesh harder than any weapon. Strength, he realized again, was not wisdom. Strength could ruin the only bridge left. Gilgamesh's hands tightened at his sides, not in readiness to strike, but in restraint. It cost him effort not to answer judgment with violence. Pride still lived in him like a buried ember, ready to flare when shamed. Yet grief smothered that ember before it could ignite. He did not come this far to fight a ferryman. He had fought monsters and gods. It had not saved Enkidu. He needed passage, not victory. Ur-Shanabi watched him carefully, as if waiting to see whether rage would finally consume what remained of reason. Gilgamesh lowered his gaze for the first time in a long time, not as surrender, but as necessity. "Tell me what must be done," he said, each word forced out like breath through stone. The request sounded unnatural from a king who had never needed to ask. It sounded like the beginning of change. The ferryman's silence stretched, then broke. He spoke of the waters of death as if speaking of an animal that sleeps lightly. He warned that even a single touch could end life instantly, that the water did not drown. It erased. The boat must be moved without allowing skin to meet the surface. The crossing would demand more than strength. It would demand obedience, patience, and the kind of care kings rarely learn. Gilgamesh listened with teeth clenched, because patience felt like insult when death moved freely in the world. He wanted to seize the boat and force the sea to obey him. Yet the stillness of the water told him truth. This was not a thing that could be conquered. It could only be crossed. In that realization, his desperation changed shape. It became fuel instead of fire, pushing him toward restraint he had never mastered. Ur-Shanabi finally nodded once, a small motion heavy with consequence. He did not forgive Gilgamesh for breaking the stone things. He simply accepted that the crossing was still possible, though now it would bleed effort. He told Gilgamesh to cut poles from the trees at the shore, long enough to push the boat without touching the water. Gilgamesh turned toward the trees immediately, moving like a man obeying survival itself. The poles were heavy in his hands, yet their weight felt honest compared to the false weight of kingship. Gilgamesh dragged them back to the shore one by one, shoulders straining, breath steady. He moved without speech, because speech wasted breath, and breath was precious here. Ur-Shanabi arranged the poles with practiced precision, checking their length, their balance, their strength, as if preparing weapons against an invisible enemy. When the boat was ready, the ferryman stepped in first. Gilgamesh followed, and the vessel shifted beneath his size, groaning softly as it accepted him. The sea lay close now, black and still, offering no ripple, no warning wave. Gilgamesh stared at it and felt the same dread he had felt before Humbaba, except this dread was colder, because it could not be fought. It was law without face, consequence without emotion. Ur-Shanabi ordered him to push, and Gilgamesh drove the first pole into the sea. The moment it touched the surface, the air seemed to tighten. He pulled it back carefully, as though withdrawing from flame. The pole remained intact, but the fear remained sharper. They pushed the boat forward by increments, each movement deliberate. One pole at a time, one breath at a time, one measured act of survival against the quiet hunger of the water. Hours passed, or days. Gilgamesh could not tell. The sea offered no sky patterns to measure time, no waves to count, no shifting light to mark progress. Only repetition existed. Push, lift, replace. The poles dwindled slowly, each one used and discarded, because once the wood touched the water too long, it became unsafe. Ur-Shanabi's face remained calm, but Gilgamesh's arms burned with exhaustion, and still the crossing demanded more. When the last pole was nearly gone, Gilgamesh felt panic rise, sharp and desperate. If they ran out, the boat would stall, and stalling meant death. Ur-Shanabi's voice cut through the fear like stone. "Do not waste motion." Gilgamesh obeyed. He learned then that crossing death required humility more than strength. He pushed with careful discipline until at last the air changed, and the shore ahead appeared like a shadow refusing to vanish. The land ahead did not welcome them. It lay still and quiet, as if it had been waiting too long to be surprised. The boat scraped against the shore without wave or foam, and Gilgamesh stepped out as though stepping into a different world. The ground felt firm, yet wrong, as if reality here was stretched thin. Even the air tasted older, heavy with memories that did not belong to human lifetimes. Ur-Shanabi remained in the boat, watching him with an expression that held neither friendship nor hostility. It was the look of a man delivering someone to judgment. Gilgamesh turned toward him as if to speak, but the ferryman lifted one hand, silencing the impulse. "This is where my road ends," he said quietly. The words were simple, yet they carried finality sharp enough to cut. Gilgamesh walked forward alone. Each step felt watched, not by eyes, but by the air itself. The silence here was not empty. It was crowded with unseen presence, like a room full of listeners hiding behind curtains. He felt smaller, though he had not shrunk. The world around him made greatness irrelevant. He understood then that he had not reached safety. He had reached the place where mercy and cruelty were decided without human consultation. In the distance, he saw a dwelling, low and quiet, set apart like a thought someone tried to bury. No walls protected it. No guards stood before it. Yet the place felt defended, not by weapons, but by the heaviness of what lived inside. Gilgamesh slowed, because his body remembered the last time he approached something forbidden. He remembered the forest. He remembered the bull. He remembered Enkidu falling away. He stopped before the dwelling and listened. There was no sound of life within, no footsteps, no conversation, no laughter. Only stillness, profound and patient. Gilgamesh's throat tightened as he raised his hand to knock. He realized suddenly that he did not know what he wanted more. Immortality, or simply the right to ask why the gods had taken his brother. His knuckles touched the door, and the silence answered first. The door opened, as if it had been waiting for his hand. No creak, no hesitation, only a quiet movement that felt unnatural in its calm. Gilgamesh stepped inside and found the air dim and cool, heavy with stillness. A figure sat within, neither guarded nor welcoming, as though threats and comforts had become equally meaningless. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were steady, old, watchful, and exhausted. This was Utnapishtim, and he did not look blessed. He looked survived. His skin carried the pale dryness of something kept too long from sun and war. His posture held no pride, only endurance. Gilgamesh had imagined immortality as triumph, as eternal strength, as unbroken glory. Instead, he saw a man who seemed weighed down by years, the way stone is weighed down by rain, slowly worn smooth. Gilgamesh's voice came rough, scraped by travel and fear. He spoke the name like prayer and demand combined. He told Utnapishtim he had come across wasteland and darkness and death water to reach him. He did not explain Enkidu at first, because speaking that loss aloud felt like tearing the wound wider. He only asked for the secret, how to live beyond death, how to outrun the ending waiting for all men. Utnapishtim studied him without surprise. He did not rise, did not bow, did not offer ritual greeting. He looked at Gilgamesh as one looks at a flame moving toward dry grass, knowing the burn is inevitable. "Why do you fear death so fiercely?" he asked, voice quiet but heavy. "Your body is strong. Your name is already stone. And still you arrive here trembling like a child." Gilgamesh's jaw tightened. He wanted to answer with anger, with pride, with the old arrogance of kingship. But the road had stripped him of those easy masks. His eyes burned, and his voice cracked with the truth. "Because I have seen what death does," he said. "Because I held my brother and watched him become silence." The words hung in the room like smoke, and even immortality could not swallow them. Utnapishtim listened, then turned his gaze away, toward nothing at all, as if staring into a memory, too vast to fit inside the room. He began to speak of the flood, not as legend, but as wound. He spoke of gods deciding the world was too loud, too crowded, too inconvenient. Their solution had not been correction, it had been erasure. The skies opened, and water fell like judgment with no heart. He described the first screams, distant at first, then everywhere. Cities swallowed, temples drowned. Fields became oceans. The dead did not float gently. They struck rooftops and walls like thrown offerings. He spoke of mothers clawing at water with children in their arms. He spoke of animals trying to climb one another for breath. His voice carried no drama. It carried fatigue, like someone describing a nightmare that never truly ended. He told Gilgamesh he had survived not because he was worthy, but because one god chose to whisper a warning. He built a vessel large enough to hold life's last fragments, sealing himself inside while the world outside became mud and bone. For days the water rose. For days the wind screamed, the earth vanished. When the storm finally quieted, silence covered everything. An emptiness so complete it felt like the universe had erased its own memory. Then, after survival, came the stranger cruelty, immortality. The gods granted it as a reward, yet it felt like exile dressed in gold. Utnapishtim lived while everyone else became dust. He watched generations rise and rot. He watched stories change shape until truth became rumor. Eternal life did not feel like power. It felt like being trapped beyond meaning, forced to remain awake long after the world had finished speaking. Gilgamesh listened and felt his hope sour into dread. If immortality looked like this, quiet exhaustion, endless witness, empty years, was it truly salvation? Yet even dread could not loosen his grip on desire. He was not chasing joy. He was chasing escape. He did not want eternity for pleasure. He wanted it to avoid becoming the thing he had seen Enkidu become. A body abandoned by breath, a name left behind like ash. Utnapishtim leaned forward slightly, and the movement felt heavier than any shouted command. "You came seeking life," he said, "but you speak only of fear." His eyes sharpened. "You believe immortality will heal you. It will not. It only stretches the wound longer." Gilgamesh's hands curled into fists at his sides, and he felt anger rise, not against Utnapishtim, but against a truth that refused to yield. He demanded the secret anyway. He spoke like a starving man refusing to hear that food no longer exists. Utnapishtim watched him with a calm so complete it felt cruel. "You think you are different," he said. "You think strength gives you exception, but your body is still flesh. Your mind is still wind. You will break in the same way every man breaks." Quietly, finally, without permission. Gilgamesh's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to shout that he was 2/3 divine, that he had wrestled a man made from earth, that he had slain guardians and monsters and a divine bull. Yet as the words gathered, the road's lessons crushed them. None of his victories had prevented Enkidu's death. None of his strength had stopped decay. For the first time, his divinity felt like insult rather than gift. Utnapishtim gave him a test, simple enough to sound like mockery. "If you cannot conquer sleep," he said, "you cannot conquer death." Gilgamesh stared, confused, then furious. Sleep was ordinary. Sleep was weakness. Sleep was what even kings allowed themselves, because the world required it. But Utnapishtim's eyes did not blink. He meant it. The test was not about monsters. It was about the body's surrender. Gilgamesh agreed immediately, because refusal would mean accepting the verdict already written for him. He sat where Utnapishtim indicated, spine straight, eyes wide, forcing his breath into discipline. He told himself he would not blink, would not drift, would not surrender even for a heartbeat. Outside the dwelling, the world remained silent and wrong. Inside, time held its breath, and the test began with nothing but stillness, sharpening into a blade. At first, Gilgamesh felt confident. He had fought exhaustion in the wasteland. He had walked through leagues of darkness. He had pushed across death water until his arms burned. Compared to those trials, sitting still felt harmless, almost insulting. He kept his eyes open and fixed on a point in the air, as if staring hard enough could force time to obey him. His body trembled slightly, but he refused to acknowledge it. Minutes passed, or hours. The room did not change. The air remained cool. Utnapishtim watched without movement, as patient as stone. Gilgamesh's thoughts began to drift despite his effort. A memory surfaced. Enkidu laughing in the streets of Uruk, the sound loud and impossible. Gilgamesh clenched his jaw and pushed the memory away, fearing even joy could weaken him. The test was not only physical, it was spiritual restraint. His eyelids grew heavier, not from fatigue alone, but from the body's ancient demand. Sleep pulled at him like gravity. His breath slowed. His shoulders softened. He caught himself once, twice jerking upright as though shaken by an unseen hand. He forced his eyes wider, forced his mind sharper, repeating his purpose like a chant. "I will not end. I will not end." The words held him briefly, then began slipping. Utnapishtim's gaze remained calm, and that calm became a pressure of its own. Gilgamesh felt watched, not as a hero, but as a mortal undergoing proof. The stillness of the room became unbearable, because there was nothing to fight, nothing to strike, nothing to conquer. The enemy was surrender itself, quiet and patient. It did not rush, it waited. Gilgamesh's muscles tightened, but tension could not hold forever. He blinked once, and that blink lasted too long. The darkness behind his eyes thickened, His breath deepened against his will. He tried to resist, but resistance felt distant now, muffled as if heard through water. The last thing he felt was frustration, fierce, helpless, because even here, even now, his body betrayed him. Sleep came like a closing fist, and Gilgamesh fell into it without ceremony. When he woke, the light in the dwelling had not changed, yet something inside him knew time had moved. His mouth was dry, his limbs felt heavy. Confusion rose first, then dread. He looked at Utnapishtim, and the immortal's expression had not shifted at all. That stillness was the first proof. If no emotion greeted his awakening, then the outcome had been inevitable from the beginning. Utnapishtim did not accuse him. He simply gestured to objects arranged nearby, loaves of bread, each one marked by time. One fresh, one cracked, one hardened, one mold-ridden, one reduced to dust. Evidence made visible. Gilgamesh stared at them and felt something in him collapse. He had not merely failed. He had failed instantly, utterly, the way all bodies fail when they are asked to deny their own design. Rage surged, but it had nowhere to land. He could not strike sleep. He could not punish his own flesh without punishing himself. His hands trembled, and his breath caught as if he might choke on humiliation. He had imagined immortality as a battle to win. Instead, it had become a simple test of endurance he could not pass. The gods did not need monsters to defeat him. His eyelids had done it. Utnapishtim spoke quietly, and the quietness made the words sharper. "This is what you are," he said. "A man who tires, a man who yields, a man who sleeps." Gilgamesh wanted to deny it, but the bread sat beside him like a corpse that could not be argued with. His strength, his victories, his divine blood. None of it mattered against the simplest truth. The body is built to surrender eventually. Gilgamesh lowered his head, and his grief returned in a new form. Not loud, not burning, but hollow. He had come to outrun death, and found only proof he could not. For a moment, he felt the same emptiness he had felt the moment Enkidu died, as if the world had opened and swallowed meaning whole. Then Utnapishtim spoke again, softer, almost pitying. "There is one last thing," he said. "Not immortality, but a chance." Utnapishtim stood with the slow calm of someone who had outlived urgency. He told Gilgamesh immortality was not a prize meant for men of breath and bone, not even for kings with divine blood. Yet he offered something lesser, and therefore crueler. A plant hidden in the deep places of the world, a root that could restore youth to aging flesh. Not forever, only longer. Gilgamesh clung to the words as if they were air. After failure, hope returned like a sharp hook lodged beneath his ribs. Youth restored meant time stolen back. It meant strength renewed. It meant a chance to return to Uruk and prove the world could still be negotiated with. His grief twisted into hunger again, and hunger made him reckless. He asked where the plant lay, and his voice shook like a prayer. Utnapishtim told him the plant grew beneath the waters, rooted in mud older than memory. It was guarded by no beast, because it did not need guarding. Few would ever reach it, and fewer still would understand what it truly was. Its leaves were sharp like thorns. Its stem clung stubbornly to the earth. The gods did not hide it behind violence, only behind depth, silence, and time. Gilgamesh prepared at once. He wrapped stones in rope and bound the weight to his body, fastening them like chains meant to drag him into the underworld. The act felt like ritual punishment, yet he did it willingly, because desperation had replaced fear. His hands moved with careful precision, not because he was patient, but because he could not afford mistake. If he failed here, death would feel immediate again. He stepped toward the water and paused, breath caught in his throat. The surface looked calm, but calm was never harmless. He remembered the black sea that erased touch, and this water felt less absolute, yet still wrong in its quietness. Gilgamesh tightened the rope around his waist and lowered himself in. The cold seized him instantly, and the stones pulled him down without mercy. The descent was not swimming. It was surrender. Gilgamesh sank like a thrown body, dragged by stone into depths that swallowed light and sound. Water pressed against him from every side, heavy as earth. His lungs fought the instinct to panic, but he forced them still. He had walked through leagues of darkness already. He told himself this was only another darkness, one that crushed instead of blinded. The deeper he sank, the colder it became, until cold turned sharp enough to bite bone. The world narrowed into sensation, rope tension, stone weight, the violent pulse of his heart demanding breath. Above him, the surface became a pale blur, distant and thinning. Below him, darkness thickened into something almost solid. Gilgamesh stretched his feet downward, searching for the bottom, like a man searching for ground in a falling dream. At last his feet touched mud. It was soft and ancient, giving under him like flesh. Silt rose in clouds, blotting out what little light remained. Gilgamesh knelt, hands plunging into the earth, fingers digging blindly. The mud clung to him like grave soil. He felt roots and stones, broken shells, the scattered remnants of things the water had eaten. Somewhere in that buried world, the plant waited, stubborn and silent. His fingers struck something different, sharp, living, resistant. He gripped it, and pain bit into his palm as thorns sliced skin. The plant did not yield easily. It clung to the mud with violent stubbornness, as though the earth refused to release it. Gilgamesh tightened his grip and tore, muscles straining even underwater. The root came free with sudden force, and the mud trembled as if offended. He held the plant up in the dark, though he could barely see it. He only felt it. Cold stem, sharp leaves, the strange pulse of life where life should not flourish. Triumph surged through him, fierce enough to burn even without air. He pulled the rope hard, and the stones began lifting him back. His lungs screamed, his vision narrowing, but his fist remained closed around salvation. Gilgamesh broke the surface like a man clawing out of burial. Air tore into his lungs, violent and sweet, and he gasped until his chest ached. Water streamed from his hair and shoulders, and the world spun briefly before settling. In his hand, the plant remained clenched, dark and sharp, its leaves glistening with droplets like teeth wet with blood. It looked fragile, yet it had survived depths meant to crush. He dragged himself onto shore and collapsed on stone, breath still ragged. For a moment he stared at the sky in disbelief, as if expecting the gods to strike him for theft. But no thunder came. No voice spoke. The world remained indifferent, and that indifference felt like permission. Gilgamesh laughed once, not with joy, but with the startled sound of a man who has escaped a noose he already felt tightening. Utnapishtim watched without celebration. His face remained calm, almost weary, as though he had seen hope rise and rot too many times to trust it. Gilgamesh rose with the plant held tight, and his mind raced ahead to Uruk. He imagined the elders bending beneath restored youth. He imagined kingship unending. He imagined Enkidu's death becoming less absolute, less final, if time could be stretched long enough to find another answer. Ur-Shanabi waited at the boat's edge, silent, eyes unreadable. Gilgamesh wrapped the plant carefully, as though cradling a newborn made of thorns. Its scent was sharp and green, bitter as medicine. He felt triumph pressing against his ribs, and with it, a new danger. Belief. Belief made him careless, because it made him certain. He did not notice how the world seemed to watch him more closely now. They set out to return, and Gilgamesh obeyed every rule of crossing with disciplined care. He pushed the boat with steady movements, refusing waste, refusing error. Yet his gaze kept drifting to the bundle, checking it again and again as if the sea might steal through sight alone. His body moved with obedience, but his mind was already back inside Uruk's walls, imagining years he had no right to hold. When the far shore returned, Gilgamesh stepped onto ordinary land, like a man reborn. The air felt warmer, less hostile, and that warmth softened his caution. Days passed beneath harsh sun, and the world began to resemble life again. Dust, wind, stone paths, small pools of water. Exhaustion crept into his limbs, and exhaustion made even giants careless. He stopped near a clear pool, craving cleanliness like a blessing. He laid the plant beside the water, close enough to guard, but far enough to breathe freely. Then he stepped into the pool and felt coolness wrap around his legs. It was ordinary water, harmless, a mercy after the deep. Gilgamesh closed his eyes briefly, letting himself feel human for one fragile moment. That softness opened the smallest crack. In stories like his, the smallest crack is where fate slips its blade. The serpent came without sound. It did not rush like a predator. It moved like certainty. Its body slid through grass and stone with effortless silence, guided not by hatred, but by instinct older than kingship. It smelled the plant, and knew it belonged to earth, not hands. It coiled once, calm as law, and took the bundle in its mouth as if reclaiming what had never truly been stolen successfully. Gilgamesh turned and saw it slipping away, and his body froze. Rage surged, but it arrived too late, like thunder after lightning. He lunged forward, shouting, but the serpent vanished into rocks and shadow as if swallowed by the world. There was no battle, no legend-worthy struggle. The theft was clean, simple, absolute. It was not cruelty. It was balance correcting itself without emotion. Gilgamesh stood dripping water, staring at the place where hope had disappeared. His mouth opened, but no sound came at first. Then a broken noise escaped him, half breath, half grief, as if his lungs could not decide whether to scream or collapse. The sun remained indifferent. The pool remained quiet. The earth had taken back what belonged to it, and it had done so without hate. That indifference made the loss unbearable. He sat in the dust beside the pool, as if his body had finally accepted defeat before his mind could speak it. His hands rested on his knees, heavy and empty. He did not weep immediately. He only stared, as though the serpent might return and place the plant back in his palm out of mercy. But mercy did not exist in the laws he had encountered. Only consequence existed, patient and complete. Ur-Shanabi watched him without speaking. The ferryman had seen despair before. He had watched men chase immortality like starving dogs chasing smoke. Gilgamesh's shoulders trembled once, then went still. Rage tried to rise, but grief had burned through him too long, leaving no fuel for fire. What remained was emptiness, calm and terrible, like a field after harvest, when nothing is left to gather. At last, Gilgamesh stood, not because he was healed, but because standing was the only motion still available. He looked at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Those hands had killed guardians, broken sacred laws, held Enkidu's last warmth. Now they held nothing at all. He understood then that the world always reclaims what men steal from its oldest rules, and it does so without announcement. He began walking again, and each step felt heavier than the last. The road stretched back toward Uruk, long and indifferent. He did not speak. He did not pray. The gods had proven they did not answer. The earth had proven it did not bargain. Even hope had proven itself fragile, dissolving the moment it was touched by something older. Gilgamesh walked with the slow steadiness of someone returning from war, without trophies. Somewhere ahead, Uruk waited with its walls, its people, and its memory of him. He had left as a king fleeing death. He returned as a man who chased eternity and was refused. The refusal did not feel like punishment. It felt like truth. And truth, once learned, cannot be unlearned. Gilgamesh walked on, empty-handed, and the emptiness began reshaping him into something quieter than kingship. Uruk rose on the horizon like a memory carved into stone, and for the first time, Gilgamesh saw it without the fog of pride. The walls still stood massive, still daring the plain to challenge them, yet they looked taller than they once had. Not because they had shrunk, but because he had walked to the edge of the world and learned how vast the world truly was. His footsteps slowed as the city pulled closer. He entered through the gates with no ceremony, no cedar trophies, no divine gifts, no proof of victory. People stared from doorways and rooftops, sensing the difference in him, the way animals sense weather. They expected thunder in his voice, cruelty in his hands, demands that would tighten the city into fear again. But Gilgamesh walked silently through the streets, and silence became the strangest command he had ever given. The marketplace noise continued around him, yet it felt distant, like sound heard through thick clay. Bread was sold. Water was poured. Children ran laughing between legs. Life persisted with the stubbornness of grass growing through cracks in stone. Gilgamesh watched it and felt something shift. He had chased immortality as if life were worthless unless it was endless. Yet here life kept moving, precisely because it was limited. because every breath mattered. He passed workers carrying bricks and tools, and the sight stung like a blade. Once he would have taken their strength without thought, calling it duty, calling it glory. Now he saw the cost clearly. The bent backs, the weary eyes, the quiet obedience shaped by fear. He remembered Enkidu's hands, thick and wild, turned into a brother's hands inside these same walls. The memory made his chest tighten with a grief that no road had cured. That night, Gilgamesh stood atop Uruk's wall and looked over the sleeping city. The wind touched his face gently, ordinary, as if the world had finished judging him for now. He did not feel comforted. He felt aware. Death had not been defeated. It had only been revealed as a truth too large to argue with. Gilgamesh closed his eyes and breathed once, accepting that even kings must end. At dawn, he went to the scribes. Their room smelled of clay, ash, and old smoke, the scent of memory being shaped into something harder than flesh. Men sat hunched over wet tablets, pressing wedge-shaped marks with reeds, their movements careful and precise. Gilgamesh watched them for a long time before speaking. Once he would have ordered their hands to glorify him. Now he studied those hands as if they held the only kind of eternity left. He asked for a tablet, and the request startled them more than any command. A king asking quietly felt like the sky lowering itself to human height. They brought him wet clay, smooth and heavy, still vulnerable to any careless touch. Gilgamesh held it in both hands and felt its cold softness, and the sensation reminded him of Enkidu's beginning, earth shaped into strength. It reminded him how quickly strength returns to earth again. The reed stylus looked fragile between his fingers, too small for hands built to crush monsters. Yet when he pressed the first mark into clay, the sound was soft and final, like a door closing gently. He wrote not of glory, but of loss. He wrote of the brother he could not save. He wrote of the road that taught him nothing could be stolen from the gods without repayment. Each wedge became a scar turned into meaning. The scribes watched him with uneasy reverence. Kings were meant to build walls, not confess. Kings were meant to demand immortality from others, not carve humility into clay with their own hands. Gilgamesh kept writing anyway, because he understood now that stories are the only bodies that survive time without rotting. Flesh collapses, power fades. But words, once fired into permanence, can outlive even the fear that birthed them. When he finished, he placed the tablet into the fire to harden it, and the flames licked its surface like judgment made useful. Gilgamesh watched until the clay turned firm, no longer soft enough to change. In that moment he understood the true shape of immortality. Not living forever, but leaving something behind that refuses to die easily. The fire did not grant him eternity. It granted him remembrance. Gilgamesh walked the city afterward as if it were new, though it had always been there. He noticed the cracks in buildings, the patched stones, the signs of years passing regardless of royal will. He noticed the way people carried water carefully, the way mothers watched children with constant fear of loss. Once he had believed himself above such small mortal worries. Now he recognized those worries as the true weight of being alive. He went to Enkidu's resting place and stood there without guards, without priests, without spectacle. The earth was quiet. It did not offer comfort. It only held what had been given back to it. Gilgamesh lowered his head and spoke his brother's name aloud, letting the sound settle into the ground. The name did not summon him. It did not restore him. Yet it mattered, because remembrance was the only defiance left. For a long time he remained there, letting grief exist without trying to weaponize it into conquest. He understood now that rage had been his shield against fear, and fear had been his shield against emptiness. But emptiness was not an enemy. It was the space death leaves behind. The space life must fill with meaning if it wishes to endure. Gilgamesh felt smaller, and in that smallness he felt strangely steadier. When he returned to the walls, he placed his palm against the stone and felt its rough warmth beneath sunlight. These walls would outlast him, at least for a time. They were built with suffering, yes, but they also stood as proof that humans could shape the world and leave marks deeper than footprints. He realized that the best thing a king could do was not to escape death, but to leave something worth surviving him. That night, Uruk slept beneath the sky, and Gilgamesh stood watching it as if watching a fragile flame. He did not feel victorious. He felt finished in a different way, no longer chasing the impossible, no longer begging the universe for exception. Death would come someday, and he would meet it without flinching. Until then, he would build, protect, teach, and remember.